On the morning of March 3rd, 1993, in Silver Spring, Maryland, Vivian Rice stopped by her sister's house on her way to work. But this morning, something was wrong. Both garage doors were open, and her sister's minivan was missing. Inside the house, Vivian would discover a brutal triple homicide, executed by one of the most ruthless and cunning killers to ever challenge the FBI.
When 3 people were found murdered in their home, it appeared like a burglary gone awry. But a crime this horrific deserved a closer look. The suspect who had the most to gain from the deaths also had the perfect alibi. Photographic proof that he was 3,000 miles away when the crime was committed. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. It's our job to find the holes in even the most bulletproof alibi. In this case, we had our work cut out for us.
A Montgomery County, Maryland police officer responded to Vivian Rice's frantic 911 call. He found a female victim dead just inside the front door. He also found a second woman dead. And a young boy, apparently murdered in his bed.
We got 3 victims here. Need detectives and evidence technicians over here.
Through the day and into the night, investigators would scour the scene for evidence, thoroughly searching both inside and outside the house. They soon identified all the victims. Mildred Horn was a 43-year-old divorced mother employed as an American Airlines flight attendant. She had been shot 3 times in the head. Her 8-year-old quadriplegic son, Trevor, who required round-the-clock nursing care, appeared to have been suffocated. Police found him disconnected from his respirator. And Trevor's overnight nurse, 38-year-old Janice Saunders, had been shot twice, in the skull and in the eye. Evidence technicians began work immediately. They were thorough, but there was little evidence to collect. They dug a single distorted bullet fragment from the wood beside Trevor's window. Investigators took swabs of blood, carefully collecting samples for DNA testing. But the blood would match only the victim's DNA. With so little to lead investigators to a suspect, technicians scrounged harder for clues, collecting anything and everything that seemed promising. Outside the house, investigators found a metal file. Police were thorough, but the killer had been meticulous. Montgomery County, Maryland homicide detective Craig Wittenberger, named lead investigator, struggled to make sense of a case with 3 helpless victims, no obvious motive, and few clues.
There were some things that struck us as odd, I think, from the very beginning of the on-scene investigation inside the house. The foyer area, a closet, the contents had been dumped, everything been pulled out of the closet, dumped onto the floor. We found a purse, which we would later learn ultimately belonged to Millie. You had a lot of stereo entertainment equipment, TVs, a lot of jewelry, furs, that was untouched and left. which again strikes you as odd. If this is a burglary or robbery going bad, you're going to take something.
In fact, Mildred's minivan was missing from the garage, as her sister had noticed. But it was found quickly, not far from the house. Some of Mildred's credit cards were also missing, but found the next day on a nearby roadside by a jogger. Investigators now positively eliminated burglary as a motive. Instead, they wondered if the missing items were a deliberate attempt by the killer to throw them off his trail. The scene had the earmarks of a planned, professional execution. As for a suspect, at the crime scene, Vivian told them Mildred's ex-husband, Lawrence Horn, was probably responsible. She begged them to investigate him. He quickly became the prime suspect.
All the family members were giving us this information that kept pointing to Lawrence Horn, that would be based on the very stormy, rocky relationship that Millie and Lawrence Horn had had for many, many years.
Danny, could you get this drum set up in number 5 for me, please? All right.
Investigators learned that in the 1960s and 70s, Horn had been a top producer and recording engineer for Motown Records, credited with many hits, including Shotgun by Junior Walker and the All-Stars. He'd married Mildred, an airline attendant, in 1973. Then he'd moved with Motown from Detroit to Los Angeles.
Okay, give me a test.
But when the company's fortunes waned, so did his. He and Mildred divorced in 1987, but their problems continued. As Bob Dean, Maryland Assistant State's Attorney, soon discovered.
We did some research on Lawrence Horn in the courthouse that day, particularly what the status of his child support payments were and whatever civil aspects of his ongoing civil battle with his wife were. And he had just been held in contempt several months before for failure to pay $18,000 in child support.
But in reviewing more court records, investigators learned that on March 3rd, the day of the murders, Horn's financial outlook had brightened considerably. With his wife and son dead, he now stood to inherit $1.7 million. The money came from a malpractice settlement awarded to Trevor when a routine operation left him with brain damage. Should Trevor die, the settlement also listed his beneficiaries.
The beneficiaries of Trevor were obviously his mother and his father, and that was Millie and Lawrence. If Millie were dead, Lawrence got everything.
Hello, Miss Horn? Yes.
At Detective Wittenberger's request, the Los Angeles Police Department contacted Lawrence Horn within hours of the murders.
Lawrence, I think you better come out here.
Yes, Mother.
They tracked him to his mother's house.
Mr. Horn? I'm
The
Officer
police
Nolan.
told Horn about the murders and were surprised by his response.
Am I a suspect?
No, sir.
Mr. Horn's behavior
Talk to you, ask a few questions,
was very odd.
fill you in on the details.
It was odd enough that the LAPD officers took note of it from the very outset. Not only did he not want to cooperate and want an attorney, basically his only questions or inquiries about were whether he was a suspect in this thing.
Police took him to the station for further questioning. They asked where he was at the time of the crime. He told them he was with his live-in girlfriend, Shira Bogan,
I was at home.
and described their activities. Later they would question her, and she'd corroborate his story.
I was at home.
If Horn or someone he employed had crossed state lines to commit the crime,
Yes,
they would have violated the Interstate Travel in Aid of Racketeering statute. A federal offense under FBI jurisdiction. Now, the FBI was brought in. A heinous crime had shocked the quiet community of Silver Spring, Maryland. A triple murder that brutally ended the lives of a quadriplegic boy, his mother, and his overnight nurse. With the prime suspect 3,000 miles away in Los Angeles, the prospect of an interstate investigation loomed. Local detectives called on the FBI.
Okay, all right, goodbye.
Special Agent Ed Roach was named case agent.
The case immediately became a coast-to-coast investigation because the principal suspect was living at that time in Los Angeles. So we involved the Los Angeles division of the FBI. Perhaps that we could assist later in the investigation, either through profiling at Quantico or with the assistance of the FBI laboratory.
Desperate for more clues, investigators sent a canine team back to where Mildred Horn's credit cards had been found by a jogger. The team soon recovered a rusty piece of metal, badly corroded, but clearly a gun part. Wittenberger sent it to the FBI lab for testing. FBI examiners determined the part was a trigger mechanism from an AR-7 rifle. A gun that's easy to disassemble into small pieces for transport or disposal, which seemed exactly what the killer had done. He had also taken another step to distance himself from the weapon. He'd very carefully drilled out the serial number. Often, a trained examiner can piece these numbers back together, but this killer had erased them for good. Another firearms expert would determine how long the gun part had lain by the side of the road. Analysis showed the amount of corrosion was consistent with the time elapsed since the killings had occurred. So this was likely the murder weapon. While the FBI lab processed the gun part, investigators in Maryland interviewed Tiffany Horn, Lawrence and Mildred's 18-year-old daughter.
Right straight ahead.
She was a student at Howard University in Washington, D.C. They gave her a routine polygraph test, which she easily passed.
Did you commit those murders?
No.
Later that day, Tiffany would talk with Detective Wittenberger, revealing 3 key clues. The first was something that had happened in the summer of 1992. Her father had called, asking her to videotape the outside of her mother's house for him, along with Trevor's room. The idea was so bizarre, she'd only taped Trevor and his nurse, with Trevor in his bed, attached to his respirator. Tiffany gave the tape to her father. Now Wittenberger and the FBI wondered if Horn wanted someone to know the layout of the house. Then, on March 1st, 2 days before the murders, Horn had called her again. He wanted to know where his younger daughter, Tamiel, would be for the next few days. Tiffany said Tamiel would be with Aunt Vivian the night of March 2nd, because her mother was flying out on an early flight the morning of March 3rd. It made investigators suspect that Horn had known when the murders would occur. Tiffany shared one other revealing incident that day. At about 2:30, the morning of the murders, she had inadvertently called her mother. Tiffany had hit the wrong speed dial key on her phone. She'd meant to call her boyfriend. She apologized and hung up. The timing of the call helped investigators estimate the timing of the murders, along with another observation. Trevor's round-the-clock nurses made entries every hour in a logbook near his bed.
Based on that, the 2:30 phone call, the 2 o'clock entry in the nurse's log, and there not being a 3 o'clock entry, and the autopsy findings, I think we pretty much based the time of death as being around between 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning.
On March 11th, about a week after the murders, Wittenberger and his partner flew to L.A.
Police officer, search warrant!
With the assistance of the Los Angeles Police Department, they carried a probable cause affidavit to search Horn's apartment. They collected hundreds of audio and videotapes. Police also gathered computers, personal papers, address books, bank statements, and telephone logs. Back at the station, investigators began the time-consuming task of reviewing all they'd recovered. They'd printed thousands of pages from the hard drives of Horn's computers. They found he'd made handwritten notes on documents regarding Trevor's settlement money. The notes confirmed what they already suspected. Horn was well aware he could gain a fortune from his son's death, and he was well versed in the legalities of the settlement. Investigators also found a map that was telling. It was hand-drawn, showing Mildred Horn's neighborhood. The streets were outlined and labeled. An X and her initials marked her house. Had Horn been directing a stranger to find her? Perhaps a contract killer. In the hundreds of hours of videotape that were recovered and screened, one home movie stood out. Horn had videotaped himself standing in front of his television set, which was tuned to the cable TV program guide station. The station was clearly broadcasting the time and date. 11:45 p.m., March 2nd, 1993, California time. 2:45 a.m., March 3rd, Maryland time. Exactly the time and date of the murders. Investigators quickly dubbed it the alibi tape, since it seemed to have been created for that purpose. Now, Wittenberger and the FBI seemed to have some substantial leads, but they were still far from apprehending the mastermind of this brutal crime.
There he is again. Same shit. He's walking back.
When investigators searched the LA apartment of their prime suspect in a triple murder, they discovered a suspicious videotape. Among themselves, they called it the alibi tape. But they would soon find a recording that was even more incriminating. A 22-second excerpt from Horn's dozens of audio tapes. It was from a conversation between Horn and an unknown male. The words were cryptic, but their meaning was clear.
Can you play that?
I gave a talk?
No.
Okay. All right, so I'm sitting there.
Can you,
Take a picture. I can take a picture of him, right basically there, but I couldn't, the noise, you understand what I'm saying? I wasn't able to do that. I didn't want to go front-wise.
After listening to that, we felt Mr. Horn probably was in Los Angeles at the time. We also felt after listening to that conversation that this was probably the individual that committed these homicides making that phone call.
With the help of the FBI, investigators subpoenaed telephone records from AT&T for all the calls placed to Lawrence Horn's residence from a week before the murders to a week after. Most were useless, but 4 long-distance calls stood out. 2 had been made just days before the murders from a Detroit payphone. The other two were made in the early hours of March 3rd from payphones near Mildred Horn's house. One from outside a Denny's restaurant and the other from a Days Inn. The call from the Denny's was made to the home of Lawrence Horn at 5:12 a.m. Maryland time, just a few hours after the murders.
What is going on? What time is it?
Was it the cryptic 22-second conversation?
Yeah.
And who had made the call? Investigators spent hours scanning dozens of registration forms from local motels.
A check of the hotels and the motels in the area, a few miles circumference of the murder scene, turned up an individual checking in approximately midnight the day these murders were committed to the Days Inn using a Michigan driver's license in the name of James Edward Perry.
James Edward Perry seemed a promising suspect. With Lawrence Horn's roots in Detroit's music industry and the Detroit call in his telephone records, perhaps there was a connection. Background checks revealed he'd served about 10 years' time for shooting a Michigan state trooper after an attempted bank robbery in the early 1970s. Now he was a minister.
He claimed he would be able to pick lottery numbers for people. People could call him for his advice. He had business cards and flyers that he would hand out, that he was, like I say, a minister. I believe he called himself on some of these things Apostle James.
As investigators learned more about Perry, Wittenberger had picked up another trail. In Lawrence Horn's telephone records, he'd noticed some calls had been made on a calling card.
What do you want?
He subpoenaed the records. The name on the card was Camilla McKinney. FBI agents appeared at Camilla's address. Instead, they found Marcia Webb. It turned out she was Lawrence Horn's cousin.
Oh, no.
She said Horn had asked her to get the card, claiming he needed it for business. She'd made up the name McKinney. She thought her past payment problems might keep her from getting a card. The calling card records revealed a complex web of phone calls. They began almost a year before the murders and continued for several months after.
We examined the records for that calling card account and saw that there were numerous calls throughout 1992 and 1993 from payphones in Los Angeles. Payphones that we plotted out on a street grid, primarily within walking distance of Lawrence Horn's house. It went directly to James Perry's house in Detroit.
I could do it.
And likewise, there were numerous calls from 1992 to 1993 of payphones throughout Detroit, primarily on the east side of Detroit, which is where James Perry lived, to Lawrence Horn's house in Hollywood.
And we figured Perry was looking for the rest of his payment. And we surmised that that Horn was waiting for his windfall from his son's estate.
But if it seemed investigators had finally hit the jackpot, the prize remained just out of their grasp. Connecting suspects to calls required painstaking detective work, logging the time and phone number where each call was made and received, then attempting to place the suspects accordingly. Horn and Perry had covered their tracks with many layers of deception. Investigators were beginning to bog down, and their frustration was starting to show.
It starts out at an extremely fast pace. Everything's hot and heavy, very high-profile murder case. Everything, like I say, is rocking and rolling very quickly. Then, all of a sudden, the skids are put on. The investigation starts to slow down. because now we've almost shifted gears and now going into a documentation that turns into almost a paper trail case.
But Wittenberger and the FBI stayed on the trail like bloodhounds. And in late September of 1993, they closed in on James Perry. They began a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week surveillance.
We had the Michigan State Police and the FBI. Both agencies agreed to put him under surveillance in a cooperative effort. It was during a week in September that we saw that James Perry hung out with a particular individual. We didn't know who he was until we checked the tag of his car. It was a guy named Thomas Turner.
A background check showed the 52-year-old Turner was a trucker by trade. More significantly, he was another of Lawrence Horn's cousins. He was also fast friends with Perry. The two had met in prison 13 years before, when Perry was serving time for the state trooper shooting incident and Turner for robbing a bank. Identifying Turner would prove an important break in the case. But for now, investigators were hoping for something more immediate. Wittenberger and an agent did what investigators call tickling the wires. They paid Perry a visit, thinking Perry would then contact Horn and start talking. The investigators only talked briefly with Perry, but he admitted he was in Maryland on March 3rd, though he claimed it was for business and that he knew nothing about the murders. In September of '93, after weeks of wrangling for court authorization to tap Lawrence Horn's home phone, federal agents finally got the go-ahead. Special Agent Roach was key in obtaining the approval.
We were hoping to get the smoking gun, the conversation between James Edward Perry and Lawrence Horn. We were hoping for a conversation that would say something like, I want the rest of my money. You know, I did the deed, the down payment's not enough, you promised me such and such, I only got this, and now I want the rest of my money, or maybe you're going to be next. Something like that would have been terrific.
But Horn and Perry were too sly to let anything slip. And by mid-November, with the investigation at full tilt, they stopped talking to each other altogether. Despite months of slow but steady progress, Horn and Perry were still one step ahead of the law. The FBI's coast-to-coast investigation of a triple murder committed in Maryland left agents scrambling to link LA's Lawrence Horn and Detroit's James Perry to their case. Investigators knew the two men were talking, but they didn't know how. Were they using Perry's former jail buddy, Thomas Turner, as a go-between? The FBI secured authorization to tap Turner's phone.
Yep.
That was the key.
Yeah, what's up?
Both Horn and Perry talked
yeah.
to Turner often,
Yeah, okay,
and
that's
Turner
no problem.
relayed messages between them. But they were careful not to use language that might incriminate them. And once again, agents found themselves back in the same old grind, monitoring and logging hundreds of calls, then trying to make links between the callers.
All right, I'll talk to you later.
One surveillance would be taking place, actively taking place, physical surveillance in Los Angeles on Lawrence Horn, while at the same time, 24 hours a day, the Detroit division was conducting physical and electronic surveillance on Thomas Turner and physical surveillance on James Edward Perry.
As before, they made a few connections between calls and callers. But mostly, the process seemed just a test of their endurance and dedication. Horn and Perry were giving them a run for their money. Then, around Thanksgiving, after 3 grueling months, investigators got a bite. Perry was preparing to move. agents secured a federal warrant to search his residence before he left. It was a dangerous mission. Perry had shot a Michigan police officer, and he was known to own high-powered weapons. An FBI SWAT team made the entry. Wittenberger and his partner followed. They roused Perry and his girlfriend from bed, catching them unaware and unarmed. Then they began to search the house. Police collected videotapes, bank statements, and other documents. Much of what they found seemed strangely out of place in the home of a so-called minister. There were voodoo relics, Soldier of Fortune magazines, and books on topics like criminal investigations, managing gunshot wounds, and interpreting bloodstain evidence. Investigators hoped to prove that Perry had bought the books as well. They called the publishers, getting only one hit from Paladin Press. A canceled check proved to be the turning point in the case. Perry had ordered 2 books from Paladin Press about a year before the murders, 2 chilling titles: Hitman, a manual for independent contractors, and How to Build Disposable Silencers.
When you read through those books, it was very disturbing to see the number of similarities and parallels from the Hitman book to what transpired inside Millie's home on March 3rd.
Finally, the pieces began to form a single picture. Mildred's missing minivan was explained. Perry had used it to get back to his rental car, which he'd parked some distance from the crime scene, as the book recommended. The credit cards found by a jogger on a road near the house also fit in neatly.
It said, if you want to make it look like a burglary, do a little bit of messing around the house, take some items and then throw them along the side of the road. It said, throw the pieces of the rifle along the side of the road. Another thing that the book recommended was to take a little narrow file and run it through the barrel of the rifle. And a little narrow file was found in the backyard with deposits of chemicals consistent with gunshot residue.
The book also suggested using an AR-7 rifle, exactly the gun whose trigger mechanism was found earlier. Likewise, examiners determined the single spent bullet found in Trevor's room was .22 caliber, popular with assassins. .22s distort when they enter a human body, so it's hard to match them to a gun. They're also small, quiet, and inexpensive. In January of 1994, there was another big break in the case. After months of pressure from Wittenberger, a grand jury subpoena finally brought in Thomas Turner. He agreed to talk in exchange for immunity.
1992. Could have.
In a deposition for a Maryland grand jury, Turner said his cousin, Lawrence Horn, had come for a visit in May of 1992, 5 months before the murders. Though Turner hadn't seen him in 20 years, Horn immediately complained of trouble with his ex-wife Mildred. Turner gave him the name of James Perry.
Yes, I'm sure.
That's all Turner would say, though Wittenberger believed he knew much more. Fortunately, he'd said enough.
At that point, because of what we had learned from Thomas Turner and what we had learned from the Hitman book and the wiretaps, we felt we were in a position to establish a conspiracy, to establish that James Perry had in fact carried out the killings.
That summer, Wittenberger struck. On July 19th, 1994, he arrested Horn at his Los Angeles apartment without incident. Wittenberger would question him for 45 minutes at the police station, but Horn refused to talk about the crime. On the same day, FBI agents in Detroit were waiting for a judge to sign the warrants for the arrest of Perry. In the meantime, they conducted an overt surveillance. The tactic is designed to pressure a suspect while making sure he doesn't flee.
It wasn't supposed to be a covert surveillance, and we really didn't care if he saw them or not. We just didn't want it to be a confrontational surveillance until the warrants were signed.
Once the warrants were finalized, agents could arrest Perry. Until then, they would follow him in the open, knowing he knew they were there. They would keep him in sight at all times. Perry grew increasingly annoyed. The FBI didn't let up. It seemed Perry wondered what the FBI was trying to do, though he seemed more irritated than concerned. He drove off, still in clear view of agents. They didn't know where he was headed, but stayed with him anyway.
Watching.
He stopped to pick up a friend. A man the agents were not familiar with.
Stranger to me.
The two drove off in Perry's car, with the tail close behind.
Well, let's give him something to play with. Stay right on.
Then, incredulous, agents guessed where Perry was going. After only about an hour, the constant tail had made Perry so angry, he decided to file a complaint. Amazingly, he took his gripe straight to the Detroit FBI field office. Perry's timing was incredible. He and his friend arrived at the office just as FBI agents awaited final word on his arrest warrant.
I want to see an FBI agent now. This is a bad idea, Perry. Now! This is not fair. I want to see an FBI agent right now.
Perry demanded to see an agent.
I'm not going to calm down.
And he was quickly accommodated. A clerk called Special Agent Roach.
Bring heat on yourself. Bring him on in. Come on, you're home now, man.
Sir, would you step aside, please?
While agents checked him for weapons, Perry confronted Roach, wanting to know if agents were going to arrest him or if they were just planning to harass him.
First of all, I appreciate
And we told him in minutes, you were going to expect a phone call from Montgomery County, Maryland, telling us the warrants have been signed and you've been indicted for 3 counts of first-degree murder.
what you're doing, man.
And the telephone came in a few minutes later, and we advised him that he was in fact under arrest.
You have the right to remain silent.
But now, even with both men in custody, one question still remained. If Perry was the hired gun, how had Horn paid him for the crime? After months of relentless pursuit by local investigators and the FBI, the elusive Horn and Perry were finally in custody. But there remained a nagging question. How had Horn paid Perry for the crime? The answer came 2 months later, only as a result of still more dogged detective work.
As we were reviewing the results of the search on James Perry's house, we noticed this photograph that in essence showed various cassette tapes that James Perry had. That was the purpose of the photograph, but underneath one of the items here we saw a Western Union card. we got a bundle of records from Western Union showing us that there were indeed a number of transactions from Los Angeles to James Perry's live-in girlfriend, Pauline McGee. The person sending it was George Bernard Shaw. Well, we now had another area to investigate for a few months.
After much digging, Dean discovered a man named George Bernard Shaw had died in July of 1992 in an auto accident in Los Angeles. When Dean sleuthed out the LA Times for the day of Shaw's death, he discovered the man's connection, though it wasn't in his obituary.
We have on the front page, Mary Wells dies. And for those in our generation, she was a big Motown star. Go to the obituary page, big story about Mary Wells dying in Los Angeles. In the lower right-hand corner was a list of other people who had passed away. One is a guy named George Bernard Shaw, with no information about him, just the cemetery.
Lawrence Horn had used the name of this anonymous dead man as the front for his payments, which were made with the money Horn was able to save. Almost 2 years after the crime, investigators had finally pieced together the whole story. It had been a cold and calculated murder for hire that took more than a year to plan. James Perry had followed the instructions in the Hitman book almost to a T. Perry had bought an AR-7 rifle and drilled out the serial number as the book suggested. And he'd built a disposable silencer using the book's directions. He'd carefully cut the parts and assembled it. He also packed a bag of supplies, a brown mechanic suit so he could walk through Mildred's neighborhood looking like a repairman, and latex gloves so he'd leave no fingerprints. In the months before the crime, he and Horn had talked often, discussing each detail. At Perry's request, Horn had sent him a map of Mildred's neighborhood and a video of Trevor's room. Horn had chosen a date when Tamiel would be out of the house, his only show of mercy in this heinous crime. On the appointed day, Perry had driven a car rented by Turner from Detroit. He checked into a motel near Mildred's house in Maryland. Perry had paid cash, as the book recommended, hoping the motel wouldn't require an ID.
I have to see some ID.
Paying cash.
I need to see.
But it did.
It's possible.
Without his Xerox driver's license, police might never have cracked the case.
We couldn't believe that he did something that dumb, that put him in Silver Spring, Maryland, on the date and the time of the murders.
Then, he'd driven his rental car to a shopping center near Mildred's house and walked from there, following Horn's hand-drawn map. In the house, unsuspecting, Nurse Janice Saunders made the 2 a.m. entry on a medical log attached to Trevor's bed. Perry approached the French doors at the back of the house, as planned. Though locked, the doors were easily opened. He entered, barely making a sound. Inside, he assembled his rifle and homemade silencer. likely took Saunders completely by surprise. But when the boy stopped breathing, his medical alarm spoke for him. Upstairs, his mother awoke. Mildred Horn went downstairs to investigate. There, she too met the killer. Harry shot Mildred 3 times in the face. Then Perry roughed up the house a little to make it look like a robbery gone bad. As the book instructed, he took Mildred's credit cards. But it seems the persistent beeping of the medical alarm unnerved even this calculating killer. He stuck to the manual instructions. On his way out, he quickly bored out the gun barrel, using the metal file to foil ballistics tests as the book instructed. For a quick escape, he took Mildred's minivan back to where his rental car was parked. On the way, he'd scattered Mildred's credit cards and the gun parts, though only the trigger mechanism was found.
All right, so I'm sitting there.
Can you,
Take a picture. I can take a picture of him, right, basically there, but I couldn't. The noise, you understand what I'm saying? I wasn't able to do that. I didn't want to go front wide.
It was a case that had to be put together by really an exhaustive search of every clue possible, every clue imaginable. And we literally spent 1.5 years, 2 years doing nothing but working on this case.
In September of 1995, 2.5 years after the murders, James Perry was brought to trial in Maryland. Bob Dean served as special prosecutor because of his intimate knowledge of the case. Perry received life for conspiracy and 3 death sentences for the murders. Those death sentences were later commuted to life. Perry has no chance for parole. He is never admitted to committing the crime. Lawrence Horn's trial began that April in a packed Maryland courtroom. He faced the same charges as Perry, so much of the same evidence was used. Bob Dean again served as special prosecutor. After a 5-week trial, the jury found Horn guilty on all counts. He showed no emotion, and like Perry, he never confessed to the crime. On May 13th, Horn received 3 life sentences without parole. He appealed once and was denied.
I think both Mr. Horn and Mr. Perry did a very good job in planning this, and they came very close to getting away with this.
There would be one more bittersweet victory for the families of the victims. Following the murders, they filed a federal lawsuit against the publishers of Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors. In late May of 1999, they won the suit, including a multi-million-dollar settlement and a promise from the publisher to stop selling the book. Organized crime tore through the suburbs of Chicago, leaving violence and corruption in its wake. Prominent officials were seduced by greed and power, doing whatever was necessary to protect their interests. Everyone was on the take.
FBI search
It would
warrant.
fall on the FBI to weed out the corruption and to find the killer of an innocent woman.
Willow Springs, Illinois seemed like any other quiet Midwestern community, but it was really one of the most corrupt places in the nation. This tiny village nestled just outside of Chicago was in the hip pocket of organized crime. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. It was only a matter of time before corruption led to assassination and conspiracy. To end it required a federal sting operation of astounding complexity.
The bank of a sanitary canal in a remote industrial area became the site of a gruesome crime. The killers were quick and thorough. Nearby, 2 police officers were out on night patrol. When they heard the shots fired, they became alarmed. One of the officers drove towards the canal to investigate. He found nothing as he searched the desolate area.
Hey, Chief.
Also on the scene was Willow Springs, Illinois Police Chief Michael
I
Corbett.
heard it earlier myself, and I've already checked the area, so
He too saw nothing.
I got it covered.
See you later.
The following day, a prominent local attorney called police to report that his wife was missing.
Well, Mr. Masters, we'd like to ask a few questions about your wife.
Lieutenant Howard Vanek of the Cook County Sheriff's Department and his partner responded to the call. Attorney Alan Masters said that his wife Diane had been out the night before with colleagues and friends from a local college where she worked.
After the meeting, some of the board members would go to a bar.
She never came home. There was no sign of her yellow Cadillac.
I believe it
He said he made calls trying to locate her until 2 in the morning, but finally gave up. For the officers, the information offered little insight.
Excuse me a minute.
Lieutenant James Keating of the Cook County Sheriff's Department joined the officers.
Yeah, by all means, you can sit down.
Sir, we were just asking Mr. Masters questions about his wife's disappearance.
He asked Masters if he could have a look around the
Be
house.
happy to. Sure. Yeah, by all
Masters
means.
agreed.
No, not at
He
all.
had nothing to hide.
Have a seat.
The officers continued their questioning.
Anything else you can tell us?
As far as I
Reluctantly, Masters offered some new information.
Professor, somebody works for the college.
He suspected that his wife Diane had been having an affair.
I have no idea
Maybe
who
the
he
two
is.
lovers
No,
had
I
run
don't-
off together.
I don't know who he is or what he looks like. I just have my suspicions.
Excuse me, guys. I think we need to wrap this up.
Lieutenant Vanek wanted to investigate further and look around the house himself.
Sir, I think we need to take another look around in here.
Husbands are always suspects when their wives
I look
disappear.
around. There's nothing
Sir,
here.
we need to look around.
It's time to
Something's
go.
missing here,
Let's
sir.
go now.
But Lieutenant Keating intervened. He
Sir,
wouldn't
procedure
allow
is
it.
2 investigators always check out the scene.
In his
I
mind,
think it's
everything
time
had
to
checked
go.
out.
Now.
But
Let's
sir,
go now.
Vanek was upset. He didn't know why Keating would undermine his investigation. Outside, Keating confronted Lieutenant Vanek, telling him to back off.
There's no cause of precedence. There's no evidence.
As far as he was concerned, Masters was not a suspect. But Vanek didn't buy it, and he let Keating know.
No, you don't. It's my case.
Just as the two men were about to explode, Willow Springs Police Chief Michael Corbett arrived at the scene.
Look, easy. Come on, guys. We're supposed to be on the same side. Come on, man.
Keating would have the final word.
Hey, Vanny, you're off the case. Forget it. You're off the case, man. You got that?
The question still remained, where was Diane Masters? Her disappearance grabbed the media's attention.
And Diane, if you would, please come to
She had been very active in the local community. Diane had worked hard to help open a shelter for battered women. She was also involved in local politics and sat on the board of the Moraine Valley Community
Also, we'd like to
College.
present Diane with this plaque to show
She
her
did
how
not
much we
appear to
thank
have any
her for all
enemies.
the hard work and her dedication in opening this crisis center, something that is needed desperately in this community.
But investigators began uncovering other details. It was reported by Diane's friends that her husband was controlling and abusive, and that Diane was planning to file for divorce. Assistant U.S. Attorney Tom Scorza followed the case.
We were pretty certain that what had happened here was that Diane and Alan had a regular marital dispute, sort of ordinary dispute, but that it had escalated into something much worse.
Go ahead and send him in.
Scorza's investigation soon revealed that Alan Masters was more than just a bad husband.
Hey, Al, how you doing?
It was rumored that Alan Masters had bribed local officials and police officers to secure favorable outcomes for his clients.
How'd it go?
Very well, very well. Nothing to worry
This
about at
corruption
all.
extended right to the top of law enforcement. Allegedly, Masters frequently enlisted the help of Chief Corbett.
If I don't hear about this anymore, it'll be worth every penny.
It was also rumored that Masters and Chief Corbett were involved in safeguarding some of the Chicago mob's betting and prostitution rings, which were run out of show clubs throughout suburban Cook County. But investigators were focused only on Diane's disappearance. With no evidence and few leads, that investigation stalled. Unaware of Alan Masters or his wife's disappearance, the FBI had already begun an independent investigation into the mob-controlled rackets of the Chicago area. U.S. Attorney David Stetler worked with the FBI to help unravel the prostitution operation.
Okay, thanks. At that time, there were a number of topless, bottomless joints that one could go to, and many of them were undercover fronts for prostitution. So you could go in, you could watch the naked girls dancing on the stage, and for a price, you could retreat to the back, either to a booth or a back room, and engage in one form of sexual activity or another with the dancers.
The club owners knew that their customers would spend more on drinks and prostitutes if they could use their credit cards. But the patrons were reluctant. They did not want bills arriving at their homes or businesses with charges incurred from nightclubs with seedy names. The club owners found credit card transaction companies that were willing to process the charges using false but respectable business names. Special Agent Ivan Harris of the FBI's Chicago field office was assigned to help bring down the illegal businesses.
The scam was using various companies in order to launder credit cards through their business to make it appear that businessmen were actually eating at a restaurant or using a limousine service to incur the charges when in fact they were charges for prostitution.
Larry Wright was one of the credit card transaction company owners. Wright would pick up the week's transactions from the clubs and process them through his company, National Credit Service, or NCS. One of his clients was a club owner named Joseph Marin, whose club was a front for a mob-controlled prostitution house. Wright wanted to expand his own operations. He approached Marin about setting up an illegal betting club.
She's nice. You had a chance to really interview her.
Marin was willing to help out the man who made him money.
She dances to the group.
Wright would first need to pay protection money to local police in order not to be exposed and arrested.
You feel pretty confident, Bill?
Marin was the man who could arrange that protection. Wright was more than willing to pay.
All right.
Marin arranged the meeting at the Willow Springs Police Department.
I trust him completely.
It was to take place with Police Chief Michael Corbett. It was believed that Corbett had been handpicked by the Chicago mob boss to oversee and protect their interests in and around Willow Springs.
The word on the street, of course, was that no one could do anything in Willow Springs without the permission of the Chief of Police, Mike Corbett. The message also was, from virtually anyone you would talk to, that he was so powerful, that he was so well connected, that nothing could ever be done about him.
I just want to make sure I don't get any unexpected visits.
Corbett agreed to help Larry Wright set up the new betting operation for a price.
Not quite yet.
In return, Corbett assured him he wouldn't get any heat from his officers.
All right.
Larry Wright was well on his way. He returned to his office at National Credit Service, operated out of a nondescript office park location. Wright worked with 2 other staff members.
Doing great. Larry, great.
But these were not ordinary employees. NCS was not just a credit card transaction service for illegal activities. It was a front for the FBI. Larry Wright was actually undercover Special Agent Larry Damron. And he and the FBI were using NCS to work their way into the heart of the corruption in Willow Springs. While local investigators struggled to unravel the disappearance of a prominent attorney's wife, the FBI had set up an undercover operation in the town of Willow Springs, just outside of Chicago. Their target, organized crime, and the corrupt police who protected them from prosecution. The undercover work was often painstaking and frustrating. FBI Special Agent Larry Damron explains the difficulties inherent in undercover work.
During the course of the undercover operation, you try to immerse yourself in what you're doing, and you try to assume that role because it's necessary for you to do that in order to accomplish anything. Oftentimes you'll hear people make comments, or you'll see people do things that in any other circumstance they would be arrested for immediately. And so what you have to remember is you're in a role and you play that role out.
Damron had heard stories about how the mob resolved problems. They were swift and violent, and their signature was unmistakable. 2 bullets in the head. There was no room for mistakes. Victor Spilatro, a player in Chicago's organized crime, approached Damron at NCS. Though Victor himself wielded little power, his brothers held tremendous influence within the mob's hierarchy. Damron was starting to move into the center of the violent Chicago underworld.
The Spilatros were one of the best-known names of mobsters in Chicago. The older brother, Tony, was the boss in Las Vegas. He represented the Chicago outfit for their interests in Las Vegas. Had been a prominent figure and had been widely mentioned in the papers, having been involved in murders and extortions and things like that.
Agent Damron quickly developed a reputation as an effective businessman in laundering money for mob operations.
We got everything back here that you need. All right, you come on back.
Sure everything's all right?
Spilatro knew of NCS's activities with the local nightclubs. They were under his control.
Really appreciate what you're doing for us.
Good, everything's going good with the business?
Yes, it's going great.
That's great. Good.
He told Damron he would have to pay him a cut to stay in business.
I'm glad you appreciate what we do for you.
Okay, well that's really good.
Damron had no objection.
The level that we had there is we were paying protection to a fairly important aspect of the mob, the Spilatro family. And so that gave us a little bit of status, if you will. But we had absolutely no authority or anything like that in the mob. We were just workers, and our value was we made them money.
Agent Damron traveled to a remote hotel where he met with FBI Special Agent Gordon Brooks, who oversaw the undercover operation. To ensure that Damron's real identity was not compromised, the two met infrequently to exchange information. Brooks vigilantly kept tabs on Damron. The investigation was as dangerous as it was complex.
Not to worry about things.
The agent cautiously moved forward. He wanted to continue expanding the FBI's undercover operations. He used every opportunity he could to sell the idea of opening more betting and prostitution houses throughout suburban Chicago. Even with a go-ahead from the Spilatros, Damron would still need permission and protection from the police.
Future.
He met with nightclub owner Joseph Marin to hash out the details of the new clubs and secure police protection.
Larry, how you doing?
But there was a problem.
Look, I got some upsetting news.
What's up?
Their protector, Chief Corbett, had been removed by the Willow Springs City Council under suspicion of corruption. Marin knew another high-ranking law enforcement official who could provide the same protection as Corbett. Lieutenant James Keating, Cook County's Vice Squad Supervisor.
Tell you what, he deals with me.
U.S. Attorney Tom Scorza was not surprised by the development. Keating's reputation was well known.
Okay, you feel pretty confident about this guy?
Jim Keating was a lieutenant in the Cook County Sheriff's Police Department, but if anything, the rank understated his influence. He was a very well-connected officer in a very corrupt department. He had connections with people of higher rank who were also corrupt, and so he was a key figure.
With Corbett out of the picture, the FBI shifted their focus to Keating. Damron met with him at a restaurant outside of Willow Springs.
It allows me to really concentrate on my job.
Keating said he'd have no problem helping Damron expand his operations.
One thing we need to understand is if there's a situation that comes up.
But any move Damron made would have to be approved by him.
I make the decision when something goes down.
He warned Damron to play it straight with him and his people.
He told us that the one thing that he wouldn't tolerate was if someone double-crossed him. And he said if that happened, that they'd find us with our legs on one of the streets in the area and our head on another street in the area.
As instructed by the FBI, Damron proposed another operation. A club that would be a front for prostitution.
Hold on to this.
He gave the lieutenant the first of many payments to ensure police protection.
Looks like a bonus for the guys, huh?
Before he left, Keating said he knew someone who might be able to help him. A lawyer named Alan Masters. Though he had no direct dealings with Alan Masters, Damron had heard the name mentioned by Chief Corbett.
Well, I knew that Masters was a well-known attorney on the south side of Chicago, that he had a tremendous reputation for being able to get things done, particularly in the local court system, and the scuttlebutt was that he wasn't reluctant to pay bribes or to deal with people however he needed to.
Damron continued his meetings with his case supervisor, Special Agent Gordon Brooks. Damron needed to know everything he could about Alan Masters and his relationship with Keating and Corbett.
Now, you're in with Corbett.
The FBI and U.S. attorneys quickly established a hierarchy within this ring of corruption.
Okay, you're making your way up to Keating? Right. I want you to...
Corbett was the king in Willow Springs, but anytime he had to do something that involved the broader Cook County, he needed to get the permission of Keating. And Keating always had to check with the ultimate fixer, Alan Masters, to make sure everything could be handled at the court level.
I can maybe get Masters interested.
As the extent of Alan Masters' criminal activity became clearer, the FBI began looking closer at his possible role in his wife's disappearance. The two distinct cases were beginning to overlap, and Damron's objectives were broadening.
Authorities call 3 counties still.
He was a suspect in the disappearance of his wife. It was thought that if we could develop a relationship with him, there might be something there that would come to light and might be of some benefit to that investigation.
Damron learned that Alan Masters allegedly made payoffs to several area judges in exchange for favorable decisions.
Now, we need to have that hearing on the Sanderson case. It needs to go our way. Do we have an understanding of that, Judge?
Agents speculated that Diane might have witnessed her husband's illegal activity and threatened to expose him.
I think we can come to terms with that. Right this way, sir.
Now trying to elicit information about Diane's disappearance, Damron continued his efforts to make inroads into the corruption around Willow Springs. He met with Keating several weeks later to follow up on his plan to open a show club.
A good manager lined up.
Again, Keating mentioned that his friend Alan Masters could
that
help.
can take care of that. He's a real fixer.
Damron took the opportunity to bring up Alan's wife. Keating said little, but then added an unusual comment.
The same plan we had with the other one. Probably heard him, seen him.
We talked about Masters' wife turning up missing, and Keating said, well, she turned up missing like the day before the divorce was going to be filed.
That was convenient, wasn't it? It was convenient.
And chuckled about what a good circumstance that was.
Damron was cautious not to probe too far, fearing that Keating might grow suspicious.
You've known this fella for a long time?
Yeah.
You've known him for a while. I've worked with him before.
Sure, he can do.
As the meeting ended, Keating handed over Alan Masters' phone number, saying the lawyer was expecting his
You
call.
won't be implicated.
I just need the mix lined up. I'm going with the same.
He proceeded to set up the meeting with Alan Masters.
Hello?
Mr. Masters, how are you? This is Larry Wright speaking.
The attorney agreed to help push through all the necessary permits and legal documents, which meant bribing officials and securing protection.
Yeah, we've been working pretty hard on it for a while now.
Well, soon I think it'd be a pretty
Masters
good
suggested
location.
they get together.
Talking about,
The meeting was set for the following week, Monday, December 13th.
Okay, I'll look forward to meeting you then. I think we can maybe do some business.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Before the meeting would take place, however, a police officer on routine patrol near the sanitary canal area in Willow Springs noticed something unusual. Tire tracks led directly into the canal. He immediately called for assistance. Little did he know that the lid was about to come off the underworld in Willow Springs.
Find these trucks out here and mark.
While the FBI continued their undercover operation in the Chicago suburb of Willow Springs, an officer out on routine patrol made an alarming discovery. Tire tracks leading directly into the sanitary canal. Police officers and a dive team responded to the site. Overseeing the investigation was James Ross, an honest cop appointed by City Council to replace Michael Corbett as the police chief in Willow Springs. Though Corbett had been ousted from the department, his legacy of corruption remained. Below the surface, divers found a virtual underwater parking lot. 82 cars lined the bottom of the polluted canal. U.S. Attorney Tom Scorza believed he knew why the cars were there. And who could make a profit by allowing them to be dumped without a police investigation?
Those are known as insurance give-ups, people who want to collect money on their car when the car is not worth very much anymore will find a way of losing the car and then reporting it stolen and collect the insurance. My belief was that Corbett had been the approver of all of the dumping of the cars in the Willow Springs Canal.
By nighttime, a third car had been dredged up, a yellow Cadillac. The license plate on the vehicle, DGM-19, was well known in Willow Springs. It was the tag registered to Diane Masters. Lieutenant Keating of the Cook County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene. Chief Ross was surprised that Keating, a vice cop, had been notified. He asked Keating why he was there. Keating had no response. Officers continued examining the Cadillac. When they pried open the trunk, they discovered a decomposed body. Ross immediately ordered that the car and the body be taken back to a city garage where they could be thoroughly examined for clues. The decision not to use the police garage was well reasoned. Chief Ross knew this case potentially had far-reaching implications, and he couldn't trust his own officers. The fewer people nosing around, the better. State police began to scour the car and the body for evidence. They found .22 caliber shell casings in the trunk. The keys were still in the ignition. Eerily, the watch on the deceased body and the dashboard clock had stopped at exactly the same time, 1:50. They removed the body for further forensic investigation. The forensic team examining the body found the skull had been crushed. They also discovered 2 bullet hole entries in the left cheekbone. The bullet fragments inside the skull were removed and sent off to the FBI lab for ballistic evaluation. Dental records confirmed what everyone believed. The body found in the trunk was Diane Masters. The 9-month investigation into Diane's disappearance was now a homicide investigation.
Come on in.
Chief Ross called in Cook County Detective John Reed to work the homicide. He was to team up with the FBI, who was now taking over the murder investigation. Detective Reed was not to trust even his closest friends in the department. He was told that through the FBI undercover operation run out of NCS, law enforcement officers were being investigated for corruption. And some had ties to Alan Masters, who was now a firm suspect in Diane's murder. As Agent Harris and Detective Reed initiated their murder investigation, Agent Damron continued his undercover operation.
Today to set up a time and place for our meeting.
He called Alan Masters to confirm their meeting to set up the show club.
I'm jammed. I expect to be in court all day tomorrow. I'm sorry.
Well,
Masters was evasive and
next
seemed
week's
distracted.
Okay too, if that's okay with you.
Maybe we can work something out then. Just give me some time.
He canceled the meeting.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Wright.
Damron immediately called Keating. With the conversation being recorded by the FBI, he hoped Keating would explain why Masters was being evasive.
No, I was wondering if you had any information on that. As I said, he's pretty busy. How about if you give me a call in 3 or 4 weeks?
But Keating was cryptic.
Maybe we can work something out then.
He instructed Damron not to bother Masters. He had too many problems to deal with.
Okay, bye.
The new show club would have to wait.
What do you got for me? Here are the transcripts.
Damron met with Agent Brooks. Masters and Keating both appeared nervous since Diane's body had been discovered. But that was hardly enough evidence to prosecute either of them for murder. Perhaps Damron had overlooked something. He handed over his tape-recorded conversations with Keating.
This is gonna nail him. We're gonna get him.
Can you play that again, please?
Over the next several months, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Cook County Sheriff's Department, and the FBI began the process of merging the various investigations.
All right. Well,
The link between them was Alan Masters, Cook County Lieutenant James Keating, and former Willow Springs Police Chief Michael Corbett.
If that's the case, and if
we can
It would fall on prosecutors to begin constructing a case proving that the three men and all of their activities represented an ongoing, organized criminal enterprise.
All right, we can get the RICO prosecution happening.
And what we had to do in order to prosecute Masters and Corbett and Keating for a collection of their activities, including the homicide, we had to show that they made up a criminal organization, a mini-mafia.
Appreciate you meeting with us tonight, Mrs. Capstaff.
Well, if you guys don't
Detective Reed and Agent Harris's first step was to question Diane's friends who had been with her on the night she disappeared.
Okay.
You said that you followed her home that night.
One of Diane's colleagues, Genevieve Capstaff, had actually followed Diane home that evening after a board meeting.
And so I just wanted to see, so I followed her.
Capstaff claimed everyone on the Moraine Community College Board who worked with Diane suspected that she was having an affair with an economics professor. She admitted that she wanted to see if the two were going to rendezvous. She followed Diane to her street. When Diane turned to go home, Capstaff continued on.
Is there anything else that you can tell me?
Further
that
questioning revealed that all of the community college board members, including Diane, were given a $100,000 life insurance policy as part of their employment benefits.
$100,000.
Right, yes, but that only covers...
The policy specifically stated that proceeds would be paid if a board member died while traveling to and from board meetings. The policy was void when the board member entered their home.
That's all, but...
We appreciate your
Alan Masters claimed Diane never arrived home that night. He was therefore eligible to collect the insurance money. Several months before Diane's body was discovered in the trunk of her car, Masters filed a claim with the insurance company. After filling out all the paperwork, he sent it off. Though Diane's fate at that time was unclear, Masters had a judge declare her legally dead. As a result, he was about to receive $100,000. Alan Masters was fast becoming the FBI's prime suspect in the murder of his wife, Diane. Shortly after her body was discovered, investigators learned that he had filed a claim with his wife's insurance company. Within a few months, 2 checks appeared in the amount of $50,000 each. If federal agents and prosecutors could prove Masters was responsible for his wife's death and that he profited from it, it would be one more element that showed that he and his accomplices were involved in an ongoing criminal enterprise. Homicide in a federal racketeering case carries much more jail time than a state charge. As the investigation began to take on a clearer focus, FBI agents working the undercover case received bad news.
Listen, we're going to have to move rather quickly on this.
The Washington Post had gotten word of the operation.
Listen, we're having a bit of a problem.
We're almost at the point where we can really make some impact.
The Post gave the FBI 3 weeks to wrap it up before running the story.
We have some have to be closed down. Is that right?
Yeah, something like that.
All 16.
Agents had no choice but to quickly bring their undercover operations to a close.
Here, so please do me a favor.
For U.S. Attorney David Stetler, the timing couldn't have been better.
The project had run its course, and the bulk of the information anybody was ever going to get had been retrieved, and to make the operation go on longer would have resulted in additional evidence, but it also would have resulted in the evidence that had been gathered becoming more and more stale.
Agents had meticulously pieced together the web of corruption that extended to the nightclubs under mob control. Now it was time to shut them down.
Go, FBI, open the door. Open the door.
The FBI hit all of the clubs on the same night with massive force. Several hundred officers and agents raided over a dozen clubs throughout Cook County, including those in Willow Springs.
Stay right here. Go on in, Pro. Stay right here.
Sit tight.
We haven't done anything. All
right, hands behind your back.
This ain't helping anything. Shut up.
Inside the clubs, federal agents were able to collect volumes of incriminating evidence. "55 people were indicted, including club owner Joseph Marin, Tony Spilatro, and his brother Victor. They were prosecuted in both the state and federal courts for extortion, prostitution, bribery, and racketeering. Several deputies from the Cook County Sheriff's Department and officers from the Willow Springs Police Department were also indicted and convicted for protecting these businesses.
Move a little faster.
After 3 years of undercover work, the sting operation was now officially closed.
What's your friend's name?
For undercover Special Agent Larry Damron, it was finally time to leave the role of Larry Wright.
I would say the finish was elation and disappointment at the same time. Disappointment that there were so many opportunities out there to identify other criminal activity. We knew that it was a good job, that we had gathered tremendous amounts of evidence, and that we had a real insight into some of the criminal activity that was taking place that we hadn't had before.
Alan Masters.
Local authorities, the FBI, and prosecutors could now focus exclusively on the Diane Masters murder investigation.
She said he hit her.
They continued questioning her friends and associates, including the man with whom she was allegedly having an affair.
There were other things that happened.
Economics professor Jim Koselniak. He confirmed that he and Diane had a relationship. He also claimed that Masters had abused Diane physically, mentally, and emotionally. She lived in fear of her husband. Diane had told him she planned to file for divorce. Koselniak also had reason to fear Alan Masters. One night, Koselniak and Diane had met for drinks at a local bar. He recalled that Diane called home to check on her daughter. Instead of getting the babysitter on the phone, Alan unexpectedly answered.
Alan?
He suspected she was with her lover.
I didn't know you were
He was
in trouble.
irate and began to
I
threaten
was
her.
calling to check on Andra.
He vowed to destroy her. Koselniak said Diane returned from the phone call and was very upset. He went to the bar for more drinks. There, a man suddenly confronted him and began firing off a series of questions.
Yes, I did.
The man never identified himself.
10, 12 years.
What's your name?
He asked Koselniak's name and where he worked.
Koselniak.
Koselniak.
Though the man said little else, Koselniak felt he had just received a threat. Stay away from Diane.
And
Koselniak would later recognize the man as Lieutenant James Keating. He said that on the night of Diane's disappearance, she had called him and warned him not to meet her for drinks.
So this was an unusual move on her part.
They usually got together after her college board meetings.
What was the tone of voice?
Lately, she had been troubled by Alan's behavior.
That they were going to another restaurant.
Koselniak
which
took her
was,
advice
again,
and canceled their
Met at
plans.
the same place.
He never saw Diane again.
The meeting was always straight to RDG.
As a matter of fact, they're on the way now.
Agent Harris and Detective Reed continued to develop witnesses.
Hey, glad you could come by.
They discovered that Masters had hired a private investigator to keep tabs on Diane.
That his wife Diane.
We subsequently developed a cooperating individual named Ted Nakaza, who was a private investigator with Alan Masters. Masters had requested Ted Nakaza to place a bug on his home telephone number because he suspected his wife Diane was having an affair.
I got a few tapes.
Hey, what do you guys got for me?
Nykaza told investigators the bug was successful in exposing Diane and Koselniak's affair.
Good news.
Ted Nykaza played back a telephone conversation, captured on tape, where Diane was talking in a highly sexual way with the boyfriend, Jim Koselniak. According to Nykaza, after playing the tape, Alan Masters declared his intention to kill Diane and to get Keating to make it look like an accident.
Alan Masters wanted his wife murdered, and he had the resources to get away with it.
You gotta stay cool.
The FBI and local authorities continued to uncover evidence against Alan Masters and his associates that pointed towards a conspiracy to murder Alan's wife, Diane. Through a private investigator hired by Alan Masters, Diane's affair had been exposed.
His wife was cheating.
Alan's rage was out of control.
Yes.
But investigators had no hard evidence to charge him with murder. After an exhaustive 5-year investigation, that was about to change.
He intended to have Diane killed.
They uncovered a Cook County Sheriff's deputy who was willing to talk.
Agent Harris.
Deputy Jack Bachman had startling information.
Keating brought me into his
Bachman
office.
had been too afraid of the consequences of coming forward on his own. He claimed that he had been approached to kill Diane. The offer had come through Lieutenant James Keating.
Bachman had a series of conversations with Keating, and ultimately Keating asked Bachman if Bachman would be interested in the job of actually stalking and killing Diane Masters.
Bachman said Keating offered him $25,000 to carry out the hit.
And,
Michael Corbett, the chief of police, had already agreed to dispose of the body. Bachman declined the offer.
No, sir, I'm sorry. I can't get involved in anything like that. No, sir.
Through Keating, Masters had clearly solicited a murder.
about this meeting we just had, and
Well, no, but he did offer me $25,000.
This was one of the final pieces prosecutor Scorza needed to bring an indictment.
He said he wanted to eliminate her. I said, what do you mean?
What we were able to show is that when Alan Masters decided to kill his wife, he simply was able to turn to the two police officers that he'd already been working with on corrupt activities and criminal activities. And that made the homicide and the planning of it and the solicitation of it, it made it an activity of the criminal enterprise.
The pieces had finally come together.
And Diane Masters.
Investigators put together a likely scenario of Diane Masters' murder.
Said she heard something.
Alan Masters had found a hitman to kill Diane and her boyfriend when they met for the usual drinks after her college board meeting. However, Diane didn't meet with Koselniak that evening.
You're home late tonight.
The meeting ran late.
Furious, Masters took matters into his own hands.
Alan Masters was at home babysitting their young daughter. He was setting up his alibi by making long-distance calls all night to prove that he was home. He never expected his wife to walk in the door. She did. She began the process of getting undressed, and he hit her with a blunt instrument, 2 blows to the head.
Masters then called Chief Corbett, who came with an unknown accomplice to dispose of the body. They dumped Diane's body in the trunk of her Cadillac. Corbett then drove away with the accomplice following him. Masters remained at home with his daughter. They drove to the remote sanitary canal. Diane's watch was reset to throw investigators off the trail should her body ever be found. They then fired 2 shots into her head. They wanted it to look like a mob hit. They also reset the dashboard clock to 1:50. Alan Masters made sure that he was on the phone at the time to corroborate his alibi. Corbett and the accomplice dumped the Cadillac into the canal. In June of 1988, 6 years after Diane's murder, investigators brought charges against the three conspirators. Former police chief Michael Corbett was the first arrested on federal charges of racketeering, bribery, and conspiracy to solicit and cover up the murder of Diane Masters. Special Agent Ivan Harris tried to elicit a confession.
Mike Corbett subsequently confessed that he was in fact the person that had put Diane Masters' car in the canal. He disavowed any knowledge, knowing that she was in the trunk of the car at that time.
Cook County Lieutenant James Keating was arrested next on the same federal charges. He too denied involvement in Diane's murder. And finally, Alan Masters. In addition to racketeering and bribery, the indictment against Alan Masters charged that he planned, solicited, and aided and abetted the murder of his wife.
If you wish one.
Prosecutors would not have enough hard evidence to charge any of the conspirators with the actual murder of Diane. Prosecutor Tom Scorza was able to successfully tie all of their criminal activities together for the jury. Masters was convicted on all counts. Collecting the $100,000 insurance money after having his wife murdered also made him guilty of mail fraud. He received a total of 40 years, effectively to the end of his life. Former Chief Michael Corbett received 20 years. James Keating was convicted and sentenced to over 30 years.
The Masters case was special in my experience because there was no one single piece of evidence proving guilt. What there were 1,000 little pieces that made a mosaic. That was made the case intriguing. It made it very difficult to present. It made it a challenge to present to the jury, but it made a terrific story because in the end the jury could see how one little piece from over here and one little piece from over there made a picture, and the picture was a plot among three fellows who had been involved in a lot of criminal activity to do their ultimate criminal act, murder Diane Masters.
Watch yourself.
The undercover investigation that Agent Damron oversaw, and the work of several other FBI agents, exposed a deeply rooted corruption throughout Cook County and brought it to its ultimate demise. By weeding out these pockets of corruption, the people living in the suburbs of Chicago no longer have to live with the lawlessness that threatened to destroy their community. Palmyra, a tropical island in the South Seas. For most of the year, it's uninhabited. But by strange coincidence, in June of 1974, 6 sailboats all converged on this tiny island. It should have been Shangri-La, but when bad blood developed, piracy took over, and the only law was the law of the jungle.
A small, uninhabited island almost 1,000 miles from nowhere. It's hard to believe such a paradise really exists. For most sailors on the South Pacific, Palmyra is a stop on the way to somewhere else. But for a few, it's a destination of its own, a place to disappear from the world. That's just what happened to Mac and Muff Graham, although it wasn't their intention. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. Crime on the high seas falls under the jurisdiction of the FBI. The disappearance of the Grahams and their yacht suggested trouble in paradise. The problem was, there was not a shred of evidence to prove it.
Palmyra Atoll is a series of small islands in the South Pacific, formed by a coral reef which surrounds a lagoon. It is owned by the United States, and during World War II it housed a U.S. Navy base. The remains of the deserted base are still on the island today. It is located approximately 1,000 miles from Hawaii and is a stopover point for sailors and yachtsmen on their way to Samoa. Oftentimes, large, beautiful sailboats can be seen at the broken-down docks in its lagoon. But on June 26, 1974, a small sailboat named the Iola made its way past the docks and into Palmyra's makeshift harbor. She had just completed a difficult 19-day journey from Hawaii, carrying a crew of 2. The boat was not suitable for the trip, and now limped into the lagoon, barely seaworthy. The ship's motor had frozen up about halfway to Palmyra. Before leaving Hawaii, the owners had repaired the Iola, which was a wooden boat, by covering it with a coat of fiberglass. The friction created by these two materials caused a crack to form in the hull. On the way to Palmyra, the Iola had begun to take on water. They had little money and very few provisions. Their plan was to live off the fruits of the island until later in the year. They had made a deal with some friends to bring supplies to the island, which they would exchange for a crop of marijuana they intended to grow. When they arrived at Palmyra, they were unhappy to see a handful of visitors at the dock area. They had hoped they would have the island to themselves. When they came ashore, they were greeted by a welcoming committee. It wasn't at all what they had expected. They introduced themselves as Stephanie Stearns and Roy Allen, even though the name Buck was tattooed on his right arm in plain view.
What's your name, I said? Roy Allen. Roy? Yeah. Roy, you got Buck on your the side there.
When one of the yachtsmen commented on it, Stephanie claimed that Buck was his nickname. Something about Roy was different from the other yachters. He seemed rougher, perhaps even a little dangerous. Shortly after Roy and Stephanie arrived, another boat appeared in the channel, a beautiful 38-foot ketch called the Sea Wind. It wasn't long before the new arrivals made their way over to the dock. Mac Graham was 53 years old. His wife, Eleanor, nicknamed Muff, was a few years younger.
Hey, Evelyn, Mac. Good to see you. My wife, Muff. Hi.
Muff? Hi, Evelyn.
Like Roy, they were surprised to find so many people on what was supposed to be an uninhabited island where they planned to spend the better part of a year.
Hi, Stephanie. I'm Mac. Yeah? Hey, Mac, you got any cigarettes? Sure.
When Roy noticed Mac was a smoker, he asked for a cigarette and took most of the pack. This gesture would be considered impolite anywhere, but on an island, it was particularly so, as supplies are limited and can't easily be replaced. For Mac and the others, this was their first insight into the kind of person Roy Allen might be. Roy also boasted about his plans to raise marijuana and trade it for supplies. Soon, everyone began settling into their new life in paradise. Mac Graham began to explore the island, the ruins of the Navy base and the sandy shores.
CQ, CQDX.
And he also made sure to keep in touch with the outside world by shortwave radio.
Everything's fine out here.
At regularly scheduled times, Mac would contact his friend Kurt Shoemaker in Hawaii and tell him about his latest discoveries.
Here's KH6IHG, Hawaii Island, calling and listening. He was just like, Tom Sawyer out in the, on the Mississippi or something. And So he would explain what he did each day. You know, he'd go on excursions, just him, with his machete through the jungle and exploring all the things down there.
For Roy and Stephanie, on the other hand, things weren't going quite as well. Roy found the island was not well suited for growing marijuana. Living aboard the Iola was difficult. The boat was small, damp, cluttered, and cramped. Their supplies were all but gone, and they began to barter their possessions with the owners of the other boats for food and supplies. To the Grahams and the others, Roy and Stephanie were a nuisance. They were not properly supplied to be out on the high seas this far from civilization. The other yachters had enough supplies for themselves, with some extra for emergencies, but not enough to supply Roy and Stephanie. The Grahams were known for their hospitality. They had invited the other visitors to Palmyra aboard the Sea Wind. Others warned them not to allow Roy and Stephanie on their boat. But Mac wanted to make an attempt at being cordial. On July 5th, 2 weeks after the Grahams arrived, and long after everyone else on the island had already had the tour of the Sea Wind, Roy and Stephanie received an invitation to visit. They eagerly accepted.
Oh, the Sea Wind was a real yacht. You know, it was a beautiful-looking boat to begin with, and nice lines, and Mac had kept it in just perfect shape.
It's gorgeous, huh? That's the
Sea Wind was everything the Iola was not. It had a fully stocked larder, and it was equipped with every high-tech navigational device on the market. It had plenty of room, and the Sea Wind had sailed around the world. Stephanie commented on its size and human comforts. She was enchanted by the big bunk in the forward cabin. Roy remained sullen. When Roy began to find the cramped quarters and damp bedding of the Iola too confining, he decided to move into a makeshift tent on the beach. Stephanie would stay aboard the boat. By now, Roy and Stephanie had bartered most of their possessions with the other yachters for food and supplies. Other than trading or flat-out begging, they had little to do with the others. The situation was getting worse by the day. Most of the marijuana seedlings they had counted on for money had been eaten by insects. Although Palmyra has abundant natural resources, including fish, crabs, bird eggs, and coconuts, Roy had little knowledge of how to survive off the land. To catch fish, he would shoot them with his .22 caliber revolver. Like clockwork, Mac continued his weekly radio conversations with Kurt, and he kept him informed about Roy and Stephanie.
Okay.
They had moved way down the end of the lagoon and would have nothing to do with the other group. And bizarre things like they started planting marijuana again to see if they could grow it. He needed, I think they were running low on food, so he needed coconuts. He took a chainsaw and cut a coconut tree down to get to the coconuts. That's kind of stupid.
It also infuriated Mac Graham. Mac loved the island and had no tolerance for Roy's destructive ways.
You don't have to do that to get one of these. Why don't you just climb up and get it down?
One day he confronted Roy about it.
I'd ask you for
Roy quickly became angry and told Mac to mind his own business. The hostility between them was building. On July 13th, Muff Graham wrote her mother a letter. She hadn't been enthusiastic about living on an island in the first place, and having Roy and Stephanie there only added to her misgivings. Dearest Mother, 3 boats are here now, but one is leaving and will take this letter with them. That leaves us alone with the hippie couple who plan to stay here and live off the land. It's just our luck they decided to roost in Palmyra. Roy and Stephanie have run out of sugar, cigarettes, and I don't know what. They've bartered with other boats. Next, they will ask us. Muff sent the letter back to civilization with Bernard and Evelyn Leonard, who were leaving Palmyra after a brief stay. The Grahams had previously made arrangements to receive letters over the radio from Kurt Shoemaker, who read them to Mac during their regular weekly shortwave contacts.
During that period of time, I was receiving mail from both of their mothers, his mother and hers. And then I would read this to them. Well, as one of the boats down there would leave, they would take the mail with them and eventually mail it when back in Honolulu or wherever. So there was communication going back and forth. And an interesting thing about it is one of the letters I read, the mother, and I think she was in her 80s, she says that she was afraid for them. She says, you should leave that place, something will happen to you.
One day when Mac was talking to Kurt, he told him that Roy had sent a message with one of the yachts back to his friends in Hawaii. They were supposed to bring Roy and Stephanie's supplies to Palmyra, and he told his friends to reply through Kurt's shortwave radio. Mac asked him if he had heard any news from them, but Kurt had heard nothing, and when Mac talked to him about Roy and Stephanie, there was something about their description that worried him.
And in between these conversations, he had occasionally mentioned the other boat. And I told him, I said, you know, that doesn't sound too good to these people. I said, you know, you better be careful. And he said, no, I can take care of myself. I'll be all right. And, so I said, well, I don't know. I think you ought to get out of there myself, or one of you ought to leave.
Michael? I don't want to hear it. No, I don't care.
Roy and Stephanie's tempers were running short.
That's why. Look around you.
During the first weeks of August, the sound of angry voices could frequently be heard across the lagoon. The other visitors to the island saw Roy as a violent and quick-tempered man who was dangerous and should be avoided. Then, midway through August, another boat came to Palmyra and spent a few days. Norman Sanders and Thomas Wolfe were on their way to Samoa. The night before they were set to leave, they had cocktails with Mac and Muff. The talk turned to the Iola. Sanders was a sailing expert. He told them he had offered Roy advice about getting the Iola to Samoa. He said he'd suggested Roy and Stephanie should go there, but Roy had just become angry and refused the help. Wolfe cautioned the Grahams that it would be easy for an unsuspecting couple to disappear on a place like Palmyra. In response, Mac opened a drawer and pulled out a .357 Magnum. He assured the others that he could take care of himself. I'm tougher than he is, Mac said confidently. Wolfe and Sanders left Palmyra the next day.
The group of people that were down there, the various boats, one by one, of course, were on their way somewhere, and they, one after another, left.
Visitors had come and gone pretty regularly for the last 2 months, but with the departure of Wolfe and Sanders on August 17th, things changed. This was the end of the season when most sailors would be stopping by Palmyra. Mac and Muff Graham were alone on the island with Stephanie and Roy. On August 27th, Mac talked to Kurt Shoemaker. Roy and Stephanie and the Grahams had been alone on Palmyra for 10 days. The tension between Mac and Muff Graham and Roy and Stephanie had increased. Muff knew Roy had a gun and a chainsaw, and at one point he'd been seen with an acetylene torch. This scared her and she wanted off Palmyra, but Mac stubbornly didn't want to leave. The boats had moved to opposite sides of the lagoon and the couples pretty much ignored each other. But then, something unusual happened.
Here is KH6IHG. I was talking to him, and while we're talking, he hears a female voice yelling, saying, calling to him. And he says, oh, what's this happening? So he says, hang on a minute, I'll go topside and see. And he says, I'll be darned. She's coming over in her dinghy, and she says she has a cake for him. And he says, I guess they're going to declare a truce or something, huh? That was the words he used. He says, I better check this out carefully. I said, okay. So same schedule next week, same time. So I said, be careful now. And see you later. Was it?
1 week later, Shoemaker was at his radio for their regularly scheduled conversation. For the first time since Mac and Muff had left Hawaii, there was no response from the Sea Wind.
I was concerned about that, and I tried for quite a while, about 20 minutes to half an hour, trying to make contact. So the next contact was a couple of days later, and then I tried again. Nothing. And then for the next few weeks, I tried, intermittently from time to time. And then it was at that point that I decided something happened.
Unable to convince the authorities that something had gone wrong on Palmyra, Shoemaker had a friend fly over the island. The aerial survey seemed to confirm his worst fears. Palmyra was deserted. There were no boats in the harbor, no Iola, no sea wind, and there was no sign of life.
Well, I had a feeling that all that time that something had happened. The boat had been taken over. I was very strong feelings about that, simply because of all of the incidents that they related to me and he related, and I mean it just pointed to that one thing, but I couldn't convince anyone that that was a problem.
Shoemaker did have one resource available to him, the radio. Having no idea where they had gone, he spread the word to yachtsmen in the Pacific to be on the lookout for the Sea Wind. But days, weeks, and then months passed with no word about the fate of Mac and Muff Graham or the Sea Wind. 2 months after the last communication with the Grahams, Bernard and Evelyn Leonard, who had been given the last written message from the Grahams, were at the Alibi Yacht Harbor in Hawaii. Bernard noticed a 38-foot ketch with very distinctive lines.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Well, then it had to.
It had been repainted, but Bernard was certain it was the Sea Wind. He also recognized a familiar figure on deck, Roy Allen. Knowing the tensions that had existed between the Grahams and Roy and Stephanie, and also knowing that the Grahams had not been heard from in some time, Leonard immediately called the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard had been aware of the missing Sea Wind. When Leonard explained that the owners were not on the boat, the Coast Guard officers felt this might lead to something outside of their jurisdiction. They called the FBI. The call was answered by Special Agent Calvin Shishido, who worked out of the FBI's Hawaii field office.
My assignment there was just a general mix of general criminal investigations, security investigations, backgrounds. It was such a small office that we couldn't specialize. We had to handle everything that came at us.
Shishido agreed to meet the Coast Guard and the Leonards at the marina, although what he heard was not conclusive enough to warrant FBI involvement. Perhaps the owners were on shore, or perhaps they had sold the boat. Perhaps it wasn't even the Sea Wind. After arriving moments later, the Leonards showed him the yacht in question. There seemed to be no one aboard.
So he pointed out the areas where there was an attempt to disguise the boat. You know, it had been repainted, the gunnels had been repainted, the nameplate was taken off, it was removed and painted over. And other things that he pointed out to show that it was actually the Sea Wind. He knew it was the Sea Wind.
Although there was still no direct evidence of foul play, Shishido was growing suspicious. There was no visible activity on the boat, so Shishido instructed the Coast Guard officers to post a lookout. The lookout spotted Roy and Stephanie the next morning, rowing from the floating dock towards shore in a little dinghy. He immediately alerted the Coast Guard, who in turn called Special Agent Shishido. But another boat owner hailed Stephanie and Roy and told them that the Coast Guard had been looking around their boat the day before. Roy noticed a Coast Guard patrol boat in the marina that seemed to be moving towards them. Roy quickly changed direction and headed for the nearest dock. After letting Roy off, Stephanie started to row back to the Sea Wind. Two plainclothes policemen were approaching Roy when he spotted them. Without hesitating, he turned and dove off the end of the dock and began to swim away. The officers found a wallet on the dock.
And in it was the identification of this Roy Allen, and it had a photograph. And I believe Mr. Leonard looked at the picture and said that was Roy Allen.
Meanwhile, the Coast Guard boat had spotted Stephanie in the rowboat and began to give chase. She turned and started to row towards shore, hoping to reach the dock before they caught up with her. When she reached the dock, she jumped out and began to run, but there was nowhere for her to go. The patrol boat was right behind, with Bernard Leonard aboard. He and a Coast Guardsman followed her. They saw her dart into a hotel stairwell. They found her hiding behind a potted palm. She immediately recognized Leonard from Palmyra.
Come with us.
As the Coast Guard officer took her into custody, one question was foremost on Leonard's mind. What had happened to the Grahams? Stephanie Stearns was taken to the Coast Guard offices for questioning. On the way there, Bernard Leonard and Stephanie found themselves alone in the rowboat. When he asked if Mac and Muff were still alive, she shook her head. Mac and Muff, she told him, had apparently drowned. At least, they never found their bodies. Leonard was incredulous. How could that have happened? Stephanie explained that she and Roy had been invited to the Sea Wind for dinner, but the Grahams never showed up. The next morning, she and Roy found the Grahams' overturned inflatable Zodiac boat washed up on shore in the shark-infested lagoon. After searching fruitlessly for the bodies, they decided to take their own boat back to Hawaii, but it got hung up on the reef. So they went back and took the abandoned Sea Wind. Leonard listened to Stephanie, but he didn't believe her story.
As I remember it,
In the Coast Guard offices, she started telling her story again, this time to Special Agent Shishido and the Coast Guard.
At any time. Okay.
this is the way it happened. This is the way I'm telling it to you.
Details then of what happened to them.
At one point, I remember speaking to her. She kept going on, and I kept reminding her that she had the right to remain silent and that anything she said could be used against her in a court of law. And she would just keep on talking.
Stephanie told him she had arrived at the Sea Wind with Roy just about in time for dinner. The boat was strangely quiet. They called out, but no one answered.
Hello? Hello? Mac? Mom? Hello?
They went below and continued their search, but got no reply.
I can't find anybody down here.
They're not here.
Didn't she say they were going to meet us here?
Yeah, they knew we were coming for dinner.
They assumed the Grahams had gone out fishing for dinner and made themselves at home till they returned.
There's nobody here.
According to Stephanie, the Grahams never showed up, so they both decided to spend the night on the Sea Wind.
All right.
They believed the Grahams would show up any time. But the next morning, when the Grahams hadn't returned, she said they became very worried and went out to look for Muff and Mac as soon as it was light. But all they found was the Grahams' overturned Zodiac washed up on shore and a can full of gasoline. They turned the inflated boat over and started the motor. Then she said they spent the next 2 days searching for the Grahams or any sign of what might have happened to them. But they found nothing. The Grahams had simply vanished. Shishido found her story implausible.
Together, and we went over there.
When she explained how they had taken possession of the Seawind, her story was quite different from the one she had just told Leonard.
No one would have believed us. They would have taken
This
the
time,
boat.
she said they had left Palmyra aboard the Seawind, towing the Iola, which got caught up on a reef and sank.
And all we found
Stephanie was tripping over her first lie.
But I knew there were at least, you know, 2 conflicting stories as to how they got in possession of the boat. At this point, we became very worried about the Graham's condition. We didn't know what had happened to them, and we certainly, was not going to get any real true information from Stephanie Stearns.
The FBI has jurisdiction over crime on the high seas. Shishido determined he had enough evidence to arrest Stephanie Stearns for interstate transportation of stolen property. Then his attention turned to Stephanie's boyfriend, Roy Allen, who had evaded the police at the marina and was still at large. Shishido checked, and there was no record of a Roy Allen, but he had the wallet with Roy Allen's picture. Bernard Leonard also told Shishido that Roy had taken marijuana plants to Palmyra and had intended to grow them to sell. Drugs and a photograph of Roy gave him a starting place.
But I suspected that people with, traveling on the Iola, which is not really a seaworthy boat, going around and planting marijuana on the islands and so on, must be involved in drug running.
Hi, Cal. How are you?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. What can I do for you today?
Shishido took the photograph to the Drug Enforcement Agency and showed it to several of the agents.
So we would like to get further information on here.
They were surprised when they looked at the picture.
Let me get into it.
They told him that it was Buck Walker and that they had been looking for him.
I'll get back to you on that. Have a good day. Same to you. All right.
And so we got all the background data on Buck Walker, and that's when our search for Buck Walker began. And then now we're looking for Buck Walker instead of Roy Allen.
Buck Dwayne Walker was a convicted felon and a fugitive. He had been awaiting sentencing on a drug conviction when he and Stephanie fled Hawaii on the Iola headed for Palmyra. As the search for Walker began with a new urgency, Shishido was also concerned about the Grahams. He knew Stephanie was lying and changing details about what had happened on Palmyra. He didn't trust her story about the fate of the Grahams. There was always the possibility that the Grahams were alive and stranded on the island. Shishido made arrangements for himself and some other agents to travel to Palmyra to see if they could find them.
We decided to go to Palmyra to see if maybe the Grahams were stranded there, in need of food, and or they could have been tied up for all we know, and immobile, and their lives were in danger. So we decided to go out there to look around, and we did.
On the island, they found the remains of the camp Buck Walker had abandoned. They took photographs and examined the site thoroughly. A search of the island produced no sign of the Grahams. However, Shishido did make a couple of curious discoveries.
I remember picking up a hatch cover, and of course later it was identified as a hatch cover coming off of the Iola.
The hatch cover was important because no seaman would leave for high waters without his hatch cover. Without it, the boat could take on water, which would cause it to sink. This told Shishido that Roy and Stephanie had intended to scuttle the Iola. Using these clues, Shishido began to develop his theory as to what happened to the Grahams.
My thinking was that they had tied the couple up and put them on the Iola and sank the Iola. And that was the only explanation we had, because we couldn't find the Iola, and there was no way the Iola could be in Hawaii, because they certainly wouldn't be sailing the Seawind and the Iola by themselves.
Shishido found something at an old Navy warehouse that piqued his interest.
I think one of the things, too, that I noticed was that in an old workshop or warehouse, there was an old air rescue boat or sea rescue boat. And it had place for 3 containers where they put provisions. And of the 3, 2 receptacle areas were, the cans were missing, and the third was still left there. And of course, now we're looking for 2 people. In my mind, suspiciously thought that these 2 cans, because it was large enough that they could have been, containing the remains of the couple.
Meanwhile, the search for Buck Walker continued. On November 8th, 1974, after spending 10 days hiding out on the lava flows on the big island of Hawaii, Buck resurfaced in a tiny hamlet off the beaten track. He rented a room and went to a restaurant for a drink. At the same moment, across the street, 2 uniformed officers were eating lunch. As they paid the bill, they showed their waitress a picture of Buck Walker. She said he'd just been in the restaurant looking for a drink, and she'd sent him to a bar across the street. The officers spotted him and contacted the FBI. Buck was arrested on a fugitive charge. He was read his rights and handcuffed without a struggle.
FBI, you're under arrest. Put your
Under
hands on the
questioning, Buck revealed nothing that could help the investigation. He answered questions with a frank yes or no, or with stone silence. The investigators couldn't find even the slightest piece of information that could help them find the Grahams.
Right on.
While Stephanie was in prison awaiting trial, Shishido found more proof Stephanie and Buck were lying.
While she was at prison, we found out that she had some photographs developed. So when the photographs were developed and brought back to prison, we seized the photographs and examined them. Among the photographs showed that the Sea Wind, or Stephanie Stearns, was on the Sea Wind taking a photograph of the Iola under full sail with Buck Walker on board the Iola. So we knew that at one point Stephanie was on the Sea Wind and Buck Walker by himself on the Iola.
This was different than the stories both Buck and Stephanie told officials. Shishido was convinced that the Grahams had been murdered. But without any bodies and no hard evidence, the U.S. attorney assigned to prosecute the case did not believe they could make a homicide charge stand up in court.
We could, but it's strictly circumstantial, and we might not win the case. And if we lose the case, and later, years later, if the bodies should pop up and we get some real good evidence as to murder on the part of the Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns, he said we couldn't try them again. So I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense.
Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns were charged with interstate transportation of stolen property. It was an open and shut case. Buck and Stephanie had been caught with possession of the Sea Wind in Hawaii and had made numerous attempts to change its appearance. Buck had registered it under his name as a homemade boat. Buck and Stephanie were both found guilty. Buck Walker received 10 years for his previous drug conviction and 5 years for theft of the Sea Wind. Stephanie Stearns received 2 years for her role in the boat theft. But Shishido was still convinced the couple had killed Mac and Muff Graham, and that somewhere on or around Palmyra was the evidence to prove it. He could only hope that someday it might surface, and then he could charge Buck and Stephanie with murder. On January 21st, 1981, a young South African couple, Robert and Sharon Jordan, were visiting Palmyra. Almost 7 years had passed since Mac and Muff Graham disappeared. That afternoon, Sharon went for a walk down the beach and made a startling discovery. Washed up on the shore was an aluminum canister, and beside it, she found human bones and a skull. Around one of the bones was a wristwatch. She had heard the story of Mac and Muff Graham and immediately contacted the Coast Guard. Cal Shishido was catching up on paperwork when he overheard part of a phone conversation.
Human bones?
First he heard the words human bones, and then Palmyra. Where's Palmyra? The agent was new and had never heard of the case. Shishido was on his feet immediately. Who was on the phone, he asked. The agent told him it was the Coast Guard. Shishido quickly took the phone and told the Coast Guard to ask the couple who had discovered the bones to stay on the island and wait for them.
When I first heard that, of course, I was really excited because I thought, whoa, somebody found some bones on Palmyra, and it had to be the Grahams, and I thought, this is it.
Shishido and a team of investigators flew to Palmyra to examine the new findings. If the bones Sharon Jordan found belonged to either one of the Grahams, the FBI might be able to establish the cause of death. Shishido was shown the gruesome discovery: a skull, human bones, a wristwatch, and some wire, all lying next to an open metal box, identical to the kind Shishido noticed in the rescue boats on his previous visit to the island. He speculated that the wire had been wrapped around the case and had somehow come loose. Then when the case came ashore, it had opened and the bones had spilled out. Since a second container had been missing from the Navy rescue boat, Shishido felt the other victim might still be inside. Divers were sent to search the surrounding waters, looking for a container like the one found on the beach. But in the shark-infested waters, the divers found nothing. When Shishido got back to Honolulu, he sent the container, wire, skull, and bones to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. for examination. The skull belonged to a Caucasian woman in her late 40s or early 50s. Dental records showed that it was Muff Graham's. The skull also had signs of charring around the left eye socket and a hole in the left temple. The FBI concluded that the contour of the hole was consistent with a gunshot wound, but due to the age of the wound, could not say conclusively that it was caused by a bullet. The aluminum box was examined by the FBI Elemental Analysis Unit. They found evidence of charring on the outside of the box. Next, the FBI needed to determine if the skeleton had been in the box. They cut out a rectangular section and subjected it to a battery of tests. The rectangular piece of metal was found to contain traces of human protein, conclusive proof that the box had once held a body.
The FBI did a tremendous job as far as the container was concerned, because they came back with a report that indicated that there were human remains in the container, that the remains had been burned, and that while it was in flame, the container was in about 2 inches of water. And they found traces of human protein, human fabric in the container and everything, to indicate that a human body was disposed of in the container by flame.
As Shishido had suspected, Muff Graham had not simply drowned. She had been murdered. The FBI now believed it had enough evidence to prosecute Buck and Stephanie for the murder of Muff Graham. Having served her jail term for the theft of the Seawind, Stephanie now had a white-collar job in California. She was arrested and taken into custody. Buck Walker was still serving time in prison, or so Shishido thought.
When I sent our agents in the state of Washington a lead to put a detainer on Buck Walker, I found out that he was an escapee. And so I thought, oh no, not again. You know, are we going to have to do this search all over for him? We found that there was only one woman that had visited him, and that she had visited him the day before his escape.
A trace was placed on the woman, which led them to her car, parked in a motel in Yuma, Nevada. The FBI was notified and set up a stakeout. When Buck and another man came out of the motel and approached the car, the FBI moved in. He was considered an armed and dangerous fugitive, wanted both for murder and jailbreak. front seat of the car, they found barbiturates and several thousands of dollars in cash. Buck Walker was arrested and charged with the murder of Muff Graham. Stephanie Stearns was also arrested and charged with the same crime, though they would be tried separately. Because of the publicity the story had generated in Hawaii, the trials were moved to San Francisco. Both cases were assigned to federal prosecutor Elliot Inoki. The motive for the crime was never in doubt.
The motive was they were without a seaworthy vessel. The only other couple on the island was leaving shortly. They were running out of food, and they didn't know when any other vessel would get there, if at all, because this was becoming the end of the so-called season when you could expect people to visit the island. So you had people running out of food and provisions with an inability to get anywhere.
Inoki knew he could show Buck and Stephanie had opportunity and motive to kill the Grahams. But first he had to prove in court that Muff Graham was murdered. He also needed to completely discredit Buck and Stephanie's story that the Grahams had drowned. As Inoki began constructing his theory of the case, Shishido was busy putting holes in Buck and Stephanie's defense. The FBI had already found evidence of human protein on the sides of the aluminum box, but since the bones were found next to it, Inoki wanted additional proof that the body had actually been in the box. Therefore, ruling out the possibility of Muff drowning as Buck and Stephanie had claimed, he contacted San Francisco's chief medical examiner, Boyd Stevens.
Finding the skeleton together is supportive that Miss Graham was in that box and therefore held together. It's not possible for me to really say that she couldn't have stayed together if she had been out of the box. However, the problems that would be required is that the skeleton has to stay together even after it's disarticulated. And that's an extremely strong argument that could not have occurred if she had died and just been laying on the lagoon bottom. The second is that the skeleton has to come ashore together, and that's just not really possible.
Shishido also decided to test Buck and Stephanie's story that the Grahams' dinghy, the Zodiac, had been found overturned.
Of course, you know, later investigation showed that if the boat had capsized the way they said they found it, the outboard motor would have been inoperable because of the salt water going into the engine itself. And of course, we made a test to find out whether the Zodiac could actually tip over accidentally, and we tried to force it to turn upside down, banging into things with 3 or 4 men sitting on one edge of the boat, and it just wouldn't tip over.
Inoki also asked medical examiner Boyd Stevens to examine Muff Graham's skull in order to corroborate the FBI's findings that Muff had been murdered. Inoki knew that having 2 highly respected sources would strengthen his case. Stevens found flat abrasions to the skull, consistent with prolonged confinement in a box, such as the aluminum container.
The key issues for us was the flattening of the skull, which represents that it had been placed against a hard, flat surface, primarily across the left side of the face. And what I'm pointing to is the nose, the eye sockets, and what would be the cheek and life, and of course the teeth. One of the things that was evident about the skull of Miss Graham is that this whole area about the face had been planed down so that it was a flat surface. And if you can imagine, if I take this skull and put it across a flat surface, and let's just say this table is coated with sandpaper, and I work it back and forth for a period of time, eventually I would shave it down till it was a flat surface. There was a second plane showing that the skull had changed position and again had been exposed to a flat surface with motion for a long period of time. We used that as an argument that the skull had been within the box and moving. If the body had been buried in the coral sand, then it would not be a change that we would expect to see. And coffin wear is not seen if somebody's buried in dirt or in coral. It's seen if they're in a hard surface container.
There were minimal animal bite marks and insects on the skull, which were consistent with remains that had only been exposed to the surface life for a short period of time. Presumably, the time after the box had surfaced and opened. But what about the charring on the skull and the metal box? Did this show an attempt to destroy the body?
One of the questions we had been asked is whether we could prove that the skull had been burned with an acetylene torch.
People who were at Palmyra when Buck and Stephanie were there saw Buck with an acetylene torch. The FBI believed this is what caused the burns to the skull. If Inoki could have Stevens corroborate this, he could further implicate Walker.
If a person is exposed to a flame, there may be burning of the outer portions of the skin, but until the water is evaporated, the tissue can't burn. And it takes a heat period to boil the water off or evaporate it before the tissue can actually burn. Acetylene torches, of course, run fairly hot, and they would do that process fairly rapidly.
The marks on the skull clearly showed the use of an extreme source of heat. Further evidence that Muff had been murdered. The forensic evidence overwhelmingly proved that Muff Graham had been murdered. A trial date was set. A trial involving people who live on the high seas presents some unique challenges. The FBI had to subpoena about 40 witnesses and then make sure they were in San Francisco at the time of the trial. Special Agent Hal Marshall was assigned to the case.
I first became involved when I transferred to Honolulu in 1981 from Los Angeles. Witnesses were flying in from all over the world, literally. Sharon Jordan and her husband and 2 children came in twice from South Africa. And one of the hard situations was a lot of these people were boating people who did not keep in touch. Last we heard of some of them, they were in a bay in Hawaii in a boat with no fixed address. So it was a matter of getting them to San Francisco, sometime having to wait 2 or 3 days, sometime postponing it, weather conditions and things like that that required us to be sure they were there when we needed them. And luckily, everybody showed up that needed to show up, and everything went smooth.
There were only 2 possible suspects, and Buck had an extensive criminal record. But did Buck commit the murder alone, or was Stephanie also involved? She was the last person known to have contact with the Grahams on the day she brought them a cake. Elliot Inoki believes Stephanie had one strong advantage on her side.
Well, she had one option. She could blame Walker. And although she didn't directly do that, her attorney certainly did in the way the case was argued and presented. That gave her a very big option that Walker simply did not have, or if he had, it was a much more difficult sell because of the circumstances and the personalities involved. He's the one with the prior record, much bigger than she is. The testimony about him shooting fish with his gun. I mean, he had a lot of things on his side of the ledger that were not on her side of the ledger. One of the other substantial differences is that Stephanie testified in the case. Walker did not, and so she directly refuted any claim of knowledge or involvement in any kind of homicide. But certainly, through her testimony, left a large room for her attorney to argue that Mr. Walker had the opportunity and the means to commit a murder.
A jury found Buck Walker guilty after only a few hours of deliberations, and he received a sentence of life in prison. Stephanie Stearns was defended by famed attorney Vincent Bugliosi, who was convinced of her innocence. She was acquitted of all charges when he convinced a jury that Buck not only acted alone, but sought to conceal the crime from his girlfriend. We may never know what really happened on Palmyra on that day in late August, though the forensic evidence paints a grisly picture.
Well, empirically, I believe that that Miss Graham was killed exactly as the charge was made, and that is that she was shot that there was an attempt to burn her body, that her extremities were probably fractured to get her into the box, and that she was cast into the ocean and then eventually came adrift. And I think that that probably happened to the husband as well.
Mac Graham's body has never been found, although investigators believe there's a very high likelihood that he's in the other box. For 30 years, Vincent Gigante wandered the streets of New York's Greenwich Village, dressed in a tattered bathrobe and babbling endlessly to himself. To the FBI, he was believed to be the boss of New York's most powerful mafia organization, the Genovese crime family. Was Gigante crazy, or was his behavior a shrewd attempt to disguise his position as a ruthless mafia boss? That question would take years to answer.
Every family has eccentrics, even crime families. Crime boss Vincent Gigante, head of New York's Genovese family, was undoubtedly eccentric. The question remained, was he truly mad? Justice rested on the answer. Outwardly, he roamed the streets as a doggedly old man, barely in touch with reality. But in the eyes of the law, he was a cunning conspirator and responsible for murder. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. Organized crime takes a concerted effort to crack. The FBI is devoted to cracking it. The case against Gigante hinged on his ability to stand trial. Was his strange behavior an act of madness or a stroke of genius?
Anyone who witnessed Gigante's ravings would have found it hard to believe that he controlled the largest and most profitable family in the New York Mafia, an organization with a long and bloody history. The origins of the Mafia can be traced back to 13th century feudal Sicilian society. Bands of Sicilian families organized themselves to rebel against the oppressive and ruthless French invaders. Mafia, the acronym for the Italian Morta alla Francia Italia Anela, which translates to death to the French is Italy's cry, became the name that these organized families used to refer to themselves, its meaning synonymous with men of honor. By the 19th century, the Mafia re-emerged in Sicily as a purely criminal culture, mostly hiring themselves out to wealthy landowners to oppress upstart peasants. More and more, the goal of the Mafia became focused on how to generate illegal profits. The tradition continued as waves of Italians emigrated to New York in the 1920s. Most immigrants lived in cramped and poor conditions. As a result of growing ethnic tensions, Sicilian Americans became the target of growing resentment. They needed Mafia protection more and more. Louis Scilero, a third-generation Italian-American, is head of the FBI's New York field office. A 23-year veteran, he is an expert on the Mafia and its intricate structure.
When they first became prevalent in New York City, it primarily victimized members of the immigrant community, where in lower Manhattan they became the victims of extortions and protection rackets. And that's how the Cosa Nostra families originally got their start.
With Prohibition, influence of the crime families grew out from the isolated neighborhoods and began to spread nationwide. A new form of underworld cooperation emerged. Various crime families across America banded together to supply illegal alcohol to a country willing to pay for it.
And I think that probably more than anything gave the Italian gangs, the Italian Cosa Nostra families, a foothold in American society. Not only from an organizational standpoint, but certainly from a financial base. Since Prohibition, certainly they then expanded into other areas.
Operating outside the law meant the Mafia had to police itself. For an organization animated by self-interest and greed, there would always be conflict and opposition. An elite group of killers were organized to enforce Mafia rules, thereby ensuring its survival. This group of mob enforcers came to be known as Murder, Inc. By the early 1940s, Murder, Inc. would be responsible for hundreds of mob-related murders nationwide. The powerful New York bosses during the Mafia's early years, Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, set up a ruling body for the Mafia, responsible for delegating territories and duties among the various gangs nationwide. Home for America's 5 largest families, New York remained the center of the Mafia's expanding foothold in America. It remains so to this day.
The 5 New York families consist currently of the Gambino family, the Bonanno, the Lucchese, the Colombo, and the Genovese family. Each of those families are also members of the Commission and also have their base in New York City.
The Commission, composed of the bosses of the 5 New York families, acts as a criminal board of directors, settling disputes between families and making major decisions on Mafia business. Each family is governed by its administration, comprised of the boss, the underboss, and the consigliere, or counselor, who are responsible for directing their family's criminal activity. Below the administration in the family hierarchy are the captains. The captains are the leaders of crews of soldiers, the men responsible for carrying out the day-to-day criminal activity. To become a soldier, properly known as a wise guy or good fella, an individual has to first be made or officially inducted into the secret society. He must blindly obey the rules of Cosa Nostra, Italian for this thing of ours. He is sworn to put the family ahead of all else. If he is asked to kill, he must faithfully do so. It was against this backdrop, a bustling immigrant community with an expanding Cosa Nostra influence, that Vincent Gigante grew up. His parents came from Naples and settled in Lower Manhattan. Vincent finished 8th grade and started trade school, but soon dropped out. Less than a decade later, Gigante became a wise guy in the Genovese crime family. Vincent Gigante's crime career spanned a turbulent time in American Mafia history. The mob had expanded its reach into legitimate businesses, the various families fighting to control them. And in the ensuing turf wars, violence was often the final arbiter. The family that Gigante attached himself to was steeped in Cosa Nostra's American origins. The infamous Charles Lucky Luciano, responsible for organizing and structuring the American Mafia, was the family's first boss until he was imprisoned in 1936. As a result, Luciano's family administration, Frank Costello, nicknamed the Prime Minister of the Underworld, and Vito Genovese, fought for control of the family. Costello won out, but Vito Genovese began plotting his takeover. A young Vincent Gigante first gained notoriety as a mobster in 1957 when he attempted to murder Frank Costello. Within the Mafia, it was widely believed that Vito Genovese had ordered the hit to get rid of his rival. Gigante's bullet only grazed Costello's head, but apparently Costello got the message. Soon after the shooting, he put out word that he was retiring. Vito Genovese was now the boss of the family that would take his name. Gigante was arrested for attempted murder and brought to trial, but the case was dismissed for lack of a witness. The location and angle of Costello's wound indicated he probably saw the would-be assassin, but at the trial, he failed to identify Gigante as the shooter. Even for an ousted boss, the oath of secrecy remains sacred. Gigante continued to make money for the Genovese family through illegal enterprises. 2 years after the failed assassination attempt, he was arrested and convicted of narcotics violations. He received a 7-year sentence. Convicted mobsters are expected to do their time and remain silent. If Gigante served his time and kept his mouth shut, he would be rewarded after his release. It was up to Gigante to figure out how to avoid future arrests. He was a model prisoner, neat, polite, and willing to take on any job. Gigante's cooperation was so impressive that some prison officials wrote glowing reports. He was released early from the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg for good behavior when he was 35 years old. Gigante now devised a secret plan that he hoped would prevent his return to prison forever. He didn't want to leave his mafia life or give up his shot at becoming the boss of the family. After his release in 1964, Gigante's public behavior began to grow bizarre. He became a frequent sight on the streets of Greenwich Village. Gigante could be found wandering the neighborhood, appearing disoriented and mentally unstable. Not long after he left prison, Gigante learned of a police investigation over his association with known mobsters. In 1969, he was indicted for attempting to bribe New Jersey police officers. Allegedly, he offered them money in exchange for information about surveillance and ongoing investigations in the Genovese family. Now, at almost 40 years old, he returned to his mental disability as a foil and checked himself into a psychiatric hospital for the first time. To support his story, Gigante and his relatives began to revise his medical history. While Gigante was at Lewisburg, his mother had been required to fill out a detailed family history. She said Vincent was a healthy, happy child. She noted only a speech impediment and a slight heart murmur. He had been a boxer, but never had a serious injury. By the time of the 1969 indictment, however, Gigante's lawyers claimed he was not competent to stand trial. His family suddenly remembered a host of mental problems. He'd been given to severe temper tantrums. He had a phobia for the dark. He had been truant from school. He was at one time obese and had learning problems. The incompetency argument worked. Gigante never stood trial for the 1969 bribery charges. That same year, Gigante's boss, Vito Genovese, died of heart failure while serving a prison sentence for narcotics trafficking. In the decade that followed, the Genovese family was so secretive that for law enforcement, it was difficult to tell exactly who the boss was. Even had the FBI been able to identify the Genovese family leadership, making a case against them was another story. Witnesses were hard to come by. Mobsters who violated the sacred oath faced certain death. The best the FBI could do was to go after individual crimes. There were no laws that focused on bringing down the entire criminal family. As Gigante was moving up in the family, the federal government was about to make the FBI's job a little easier. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer Influences and Corrupt Organization Act, better known as the RICO laws.
What the racketeering law allowed us to do was to look at the family as a criminal enterprise and to attack the family as a criminal act. That became much more effective if you look back from the mid-70s to the 80s in terms of actually indicting the entire family and the entire hierarchy of that family.
The RICO laws require that the government prove that mafia families are essentially criminal enterprises. They must show that the crimes committed by the boss and members of his family are committed to either expand the criminal enterprise or to increase a family member's position within that enterprise. To successfully bring down a family, the government has to prove that any one of several criminal acts, ranging from racketeering and extortion to murder, has been committed. By 1979, now armed with federal legislation aimed directly at organized crime, the FBI had devoted teams to exclusively focus investigations on the 5 major families. The FBI's Genovese squad finally learned that Vincent Gigante was on a fast track with the family. Special Agent Richard Rudolph had been assigned to investigate the Genovese crime family.
Through informants and other law enforcement agencies who were exchanging information, we became aware that Mr. Gigante was an individual with much respect in the Genovese crime family and operated out of an area in Lower Manhattan. Because he was an up-and-coming person with a lot of respect within the family, we began to do some surveillances of Mr. Gigante.
With the FBI continuing to build its arsenal against organized crime, Gigante's cat and mouse game intensified. He stepped up his public show of mental disorder. In the late 70s and into the 80s, he was admitted 5 more times for psychiatric treatment. The FBI continued to keep tabs on Gigante. Agents learned that he frequented the Triangle Social Club, a gathering place for Genovese crime figures.
He could be found there almost on a daily basis. He lived in the neighborhood. He was an individual that could be found there in the late afternoons and into the early hours of the morning, and people would come to see him as opposed to him going to see other people.
Though Gigante's association in the Genovese family seemed certain to investigators, Gigante's family and doctors continuously told investigators that he led a very narrow existence. They said his whole world was confined to the block where he lived and the church he attended with his mother. He was barely functional at home and could not care for himself, they said. But with every passing day, the FBI and New York police were seeing a very different Vincent Gigante. In the early 1980s, the Mafia in the Northeast went through a particularly tumultuous time with several killings. Internal disputes within the family resulted in a string of assassinations. The FBI suspected Gigante was responsible for these gangland executions, especially those intended as punishment for breaking Cosa Nostra rules. Gigante was known to be a traditionalist. He wanted the rules obeyed, and when they were broken, retribution was sure to follow. It started with the murder of Philadelphia crime boss Angelo Bruno. Although Bruno's family was well outside New York, all families answered to the members of the commission. Gigante was upset because Bruno had been assassinated by his own men in a grab for control of the family. A Cosa Nostra rule had been violated. No one can kill a boss unless the commission sanctions it, and they seldom do. It was rumored that Gigante himself launched an investigation into Bruno's murder. Retribution was swift. Less than a month later, Tony Bananas Caponegro, identified as one of Bruno's assassins, was found dead. He had been shot 15 times and stabbed in the back. His body was stuffed in a trunk, and $20 bills were littered around his body, a clear message that he was killed for his greed. On the same day, another body was discovered. This time it was Fred Salerno, dead of gunshot wounds, dumped in a vacant lot. He too had allegedly participated in Bruno's murder. Phil Testa had taken Angelo Bruno's place as boss. His reign was short. Almost a year after Bruno's execution, Testa was blown up entering his own home. Another boss killed without the blessing of the commission. Another avenging act would follow. Rocco Marinucci was next, found dead with fireworks stuffed in his mouth. a gesture designed to show that he was killed for the way in which he had killed Testa. If the Cosa Nostra was to flourish, all of its members had to comply with its rules. There were no exceptions. Gigante was believed to have ordered the murder of one of his own crime family members. Genovese soldier Jerry Papa had murdered 2 Colombo family members without permission. As punishment for his unsanctioned act, he was brutally shot and killed by members of his own criminal family. Had Gigante become the enforcer for the Northeast Cosa Nostra? Informers within the mob told federal agents that all of these killings had been ordered by Gigante. But information given by admitted criminals is always a problem for potential juries. Criminals will say anything if their cooperation can be traded for a reduced prison sentence. The FBI needed more than the words of criminals looking for a deal. Gigante knew this, and he protected himself accordingly. It seemed that Gigante was now the boss. The FBI began a more focused surveillance effort on Gigante. They learned that the Genovese family had also infiltrated several of New York's major industries: the garment trade, trucking, garbage collection, airport cargo handling, and the city's seafood industry. Vincent Gigante was known on the streets as the Chin, an abbreviation of Cinzino, Little Vincent. Fearing FBI surveillance and wiretaps, family members were not allowed to speak his name. They were to refer to him with hand signals, touching their chins to communicate his nickname. Bringing down the Chin was going to take every bit of know-how that the FBI could muster. They were going to have to create their own luck. As a surveillance team member watched one day, a telling crack in the Chin's ruse appeared. The seemingly frail man was being helped across a busy street. When oncoming traffic threatened, he became suddenly animated, racing to safety. His helplessness somehow overtook him again on the other side. Clearly, there were 2 Gigantes, the mentally troubled one displayed to the public, and the determined boss of the Genovese administration. The FBI would soon learn of a 3rd. Gigante's ex-wife and their 5 children lived in New Jersey while he maintained a relationship with his long-standing companion, Olympia Esposito. He usually called on her late at night, looking quite dapper before he was aware of the surveillance.
We learned that he frequently visited a townhouse which was located up on 77th Street and the east side of Manhattan, where we later learned that a common law, he was living with his common law wife, and he had been married previously, and this was his second family there at this residence.
Soon the FBI knew all of the Chin's hangouts. This gave surveillance teams an opportunity to observe Gigante without his knowledge. A major break came when NYPD Organized Crime Task Force member Detective Tom Bruno was able to snap photos of some of Gigante's activities.
In 1984, I was assigned to a joint organized crime task force. That task force consisted of FBI agents and New York City police officers, detectives. And we were assigned to investigate the Genovese crime family. Then the next step was to go to Sullivan Street, where Chin Gigante lived. His apartment was above a pet store, alleged pet store. And he also had a social club on the block. And when you'd go by the social club, you'd see numerous people that were in the photos. And you'd see them standing in front of, going inside, and then sometimes crossing the street, going to the pet store, which was where the Chin, we believe, met people.
Pet store really never had any kind of business that we could see. It had a little cat box in the window, and basically that was it.
More and more, Gigante was seen acting normally when he was unaware he was being watched.
I see Chin Gigante and I see Andrew Gigante, which is his son, come out of his residence. And I'm just minding my business, walking up the block. Andrew leaves to get in his car, and Chin is standing on the corner, and he wasn't helped out of his building, and he was standing on the corner. Andrew gets in his car, pulls out. As he pulls out, there's a car coming up Sullivan Street. It blows the horn. Chin Gigante yells, "Hey, what are you, in a rush?" As he does this, I come into the lighted area. He looks, sees me, and all of a sudden his head goes down, and he plays the sick point.
Another break followed Detective Bruno's surveillance successes. The FBI managed to rent an apartment close to the townhouse of Gigante's companion, Ms. Esposito. An agent would exit through a back door in the rented apartment building and position himself about 50 feet from Ms. Esposito's townhouse. From there, Miss Esposito and Gigante could be seen from time to time. An agent watched the couple for 4 months between midnight and 2 a.m. Assistant U.S. Attorney Andrew Weissman, who later would have to prove Gigante's competency to stand trial, was delighted with the agent's observations.
And lo and behold, when he was inside in a place where he didn't think he was being observed, he did all of the normal things that any of us would do. As a matter of fact, what was unusual about those surveillances was that there was nothing unusual about him. He was normal. He was talking to people. He was counting money. He never wore a shoddy bathrobe. Indeed, the only time he was seen in a bathrobe was, not surprisingly, when he got out of the shower. He would wear a nice, fluffy, Brooks Brothers type bathrobe, which was not at all like the bathrobe that he would wear when he was on the street. So it became pretty obvious to the people conducting the surveillance that he was engaging in a concerted effort to give an appearance to the public that was false, that was not the way he behaved in real life.
Investigators continued to watch Gigante's bizarre public behavior. But photos themselves are only a single link in proving criminal activity. Investigators needed hard evidence to corroborate what the photos were suggesting, that Gigante was in fact the boss. One wiretap conversation between Genevieve's crew members gave investigators more proof of Gigante's position in the family. On the tapes, known Genovese members were complaining about the chin. Assistant U.S. Attorney George Stamboulidis reviewed these tapes to help prepare a case against Gigante.
He's constantly nitpicking his men, trying to always, with a million questions, drilling them and questioning them on what they're involved in. He's always looking to get money from them, or money from some of the schemes and how he earned, and how much money he would make from the gambling operations at the Triangle Social Club and things like that.
While Gigante micromanaged the internal affairs of his family, the tabloids began calling him the Odd Father.
He would check himself in to a hospital once a year for what his colleagues in the mafia sarcastically referred to as tune-ups, so that he would have a paper trail showing that he had some, or giving the impression that he had some mental condition. And with the assistance of people around him and people in his family, he was able to cultivate this paper trail, giving the impression to anyone who looked at the cold medical records that here's someone who, year in, year out, was being treated for some form of mental illness.
Gigante knew how to protect himself, both publicly and privately.
Mr. Gigante was very clever in how he conducted business, and he limited his contacts with members of the family. If there were messages or items to be discussed regarding illegal activities conducted by the Genovese family, there would be messages passed on to people immediately surrounding him. Access to him was very limited. If the other family wanted to meet with him, more than likely they would have to send a message.
Gigante avoided the normal sit-downs or more formal meetings held regularly by other family bosses. He would take meetings when businesses demanded his attention. He and his visitors would stroll the sidewalks through the neighborhood, ensuring that surveillance wiretaps would not pick up any incriminating conversations. The always careful Gigante also suspected Ms. Esposito's phone was tapped, and it was. He never talked business on the phone. He would simply use a payphone or make arrangements to talk elsewhere. The FBI would not be able to use the Chin's own words to make a case against him. Other mobsters were not as smart. Sophisticated bugging operations were allowing the FBI to capture a multitude of other mob business on tape. In early 1985, the Justice Department was bearing down hard on a number of high-level organized crime figures. Most were being charged under the RICO Act. Though RICO had been around since the early 70s, it was only now receiving its first real test. Two of Gigante's men had gotten wind that the bosses of the Gambino and Lucchese families would soon be arrested. They wondered if the Chin was vulnerable. One commented that if he gets pinched, all those years in the asylum would be for nothing. On February 19th, the arrests of several crime family bosses were made. The next day, Vincent Gigante checked himself into the hospital and stayed a week. He had successfully avoided the indictment against the New York bosses. Among those arrested was Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino crime family. Prosecutors never brought him to trial. He was killed before they had the chance. By Cosa Nostra standards, the unsanctioned murders of Gambino boss Paul Castellano and his underboss Tommy Bellotti were unpardonable. Although John Gotti, a captain in the Gambino family, acted shocked at Castellano's death, it was widely believed that he was responsible. Within 2 weeks of the murders, Gotti had publicly taken over as boss. Vincent Gigante issued a subtle warning to Gotti. Without mentioning names, he told Gotti that the murderer would have to pay. It took 2 years, but in 1987, Gigante acted to avenge the murder of his friend and partner in mob business. Through his counselor, Bobby Manna, and some Lucchese family members, Gigante plotted to have Gotti killed. The planning session at a New Jersey restaurant was bugged, and because it was, the FBI saved John Gotti's life. If agents intercept information of a murder plot, they are required by law to try to prevent the killing. So based on the tape, agents warned Gotti. Acting on the FBI warning, John Gotti changed his plans on the day the murder was to take place. Because he was not where he was expected, the murder plot failed. Gigante, however, did not give up. He asked Vic Amuso, acting boss of the Lucchese family, to supervise another hit. It was up to Amuso and his men to work out the details.
Doesn't go off?
And that was to have Amuso reach out to Al Diorco, one of his trusted men, just as Manna was one of Gigante's trusted men, and have Diorco use his contacts in other parts of the country to acquire a remote-controlled bomb.
But Gotti was arrested and imprisoned before the second plot could be carried out. He died of cancer while serving a life sentence for racketeering involving extortion and murder, including Castellano's. Meanwhile, the FBI had Chin's men on tape, conspiring the murder. As the FBI's investigation into Genovese family operations continued, information about a corrupt construction scheme was coming to light. They learned that for years, much of the Genovese family income came from one segment of the construction industry, the window business. The family had managed to keep its hold on window replacement jobs for all of New York City's public housing projects.
We learned that at that time there was an enormous amount of money being put into refurbishing some of the New York City Housing Authority windows. There was an energy crisis underway, and the timing of this was ideal for the organized crime people to become more active in it. What we learned was that the Genovese family, along with 2 or 3 other families, were becoming involved in companies that were bidding and installing the windows in some of these housing projects. From the late 1970s up until the late 1980s, there was approximately $190 million worth of contracts given out by the city of New York for the window replacement industry.
It was classic mob business and a textbook example of racketeering. The mafia took over an industry to the exclusion of legitimate businesses. Union officials were corrupted. In this case, Iron Workers Local 580. Bids were rigged, and companies or workers trying to play by the rules lost out. For years, the Lucchese and Genovese families operated their construction schemes autonomously. By the early 80s, they realized that a partnership would be much more profitable. By this time, the Lucchese family had a firm hold on Local 580, and the Genovese family had corrupted several contractors. They cooperated because it meant more business.
By using the Local 580 as a tool, they were able to exclude several contractors from coming in and bidding on some of these projects, and in essence created a somewhat of a monopoly for themselves.
On nearly all City Housing Authority work, and on much of the new construction for the city, the Genovese contractors and installers paid $2 a window. $1 went to the Lucchese family, 25 cents to the collector, and 75 cents to the boss for the family's role in handling the union. The other $1 went to the crooked union officials who looked the other way as jobs went to non-union workers. Refusal to cooperate often carried a penalty of violence. In the late 80s, a carpenters union delegate had both of his legs broken by Genovese men for refusing to cooperate, though he maintained that he was unable to get a good look at his attackers. And in 1992, a delegate from Local 580 was shot and killed coming out of his house on Long Island over a disagreement with his Cosa Nostra contracts. The Lucchese and Genovese family arrangement was working very smoothly. That is, until Peter Savino was persuaded to wear a wire. Savino was a Genovese soldier and point man for the window racket.
We built a case on him, a murder case on him, and it was sufficiently compelling that he realized, like many of these people, that he didn't want to die in jail. So what did he do? He decided to cooperate. And for an 18-month period made tape recordings of people in the Genovese family and people in the Lucchese family operating this scheme.
Vincent Gigante didn't realize Peter Savino was turning on him. He was happy with Savino's work and satisfied with the window scheme's progression. Savino kept track of the money. He managed the contracts. He supervised the bids. He arranged the payoffs. The boss was happy, but some Genovese family members began to suspect Savino. When bodies were found in the basement of a building he owned, Genovese members were surprised that he was never seriously investigated by law enforcement.
much are your people going to cost me?
As a result of that, people speculated, well, Savino wasn't arrested, yet these bodies were found in a building that's tied to him. Maybe he's cooperating, but nobody was really sure.
Savino was a cash cow for Vincent Gigante. He was bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars for the Genovese family every month. So when Gigante was told of Savino's betrayal, he chose not to believe it and initially refused to order him killed. Savino continued to wear the wire, trying to get other family members to acknowledge Chin and his position as boss of the family. Gigante's troops, however, could never be persuaded to break the boss's rule about not mentioning his name.
Remember Uniseal? Vincent had said when it came time to bid. Oh, okay, I'll mention him. He had said to go out and bid the work.
It was, don't mention that name. How can you talk like that? That was pretty damning proof. Even though it didn't give you a specific crime, it told you that this was a man to be feared. It was hardly somebody who was incompetent.
Shortly thereafter, it came to Gigante's attention that Savino was in fact cooperating. Furious at this betrayal, Gigante ordered the murder of Peter Savino. By that time, the FBI had relocated Savino well out of Genovese family reach, but not before he supplied agents with thousands of hours of taped conversations.
Mr. Savino was also in a position to provide us with the historical aspects of how this scheme developed, his relationship with the leaders of both the Lucchese and Genovese crime family, and what their participation was in this thing. Mr. Savino also was able to tell us how the various members of all of these families interacted with Local 580, which was used, again, as the tool to make the scheme work.
The FBI was successfully employing the RICO laws to bring down New York's most powerful bosses. As a result, high-ranking family members saw that their only way to avoid long prison terms was to cooperate. Among them were Gambino family underboss Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gigante was finally arrested and charged under the RICO laws with ordering 6 people murdered, conspiring to kill 3 others, and at least 24 counts of racketeering. In short, Gigante was charged with being the boss of the Genovese crime family. But Gigante still had his mental illness history to fall back on.
Mr. Gigante was indicted in May of 1990, and a second indictment was filed against him in June of 1993. The case against Mr. Gigante was unusual, that it spanned several years before it actually went to trial. He eventually went to trial in June of 1997. During that period of time, the issue that was before the courts was that whether he was competent to stand trial or not. That issue was finally resolved in 1996.
7 years after his arrest, a federal district judge declared Vincent Gigante competent to stand trial. Vincent the Chin Gigante was 69 years old when a jury convicted him of conspiring to kill 3 mafia figures, including Gotti and Savino. He was also found guilty of extortion and union payoff conspiracies in the window replacement scheme. But jurors failed to convict him on charges of directly ordering 6 murders. Now that Gigante was convicted, his defense lawyers argued that he was not fit to be sentenced. They claimed he was too old, too frail, and too mentally incompetent to understand the punishment. While awaiting sentencing, Gigante was confined to a prison hospital and examined by several doctors. Gigante was given several PET scans, a procedure that uses a radioactive tracer to measure brain chemistry. A 1991 scan, first read as normal, was later found to be too flawed to use in diagnosis. A 1993 scan did show some abnormalities. But at least one expert, Dr. Jonathan Brody, judged these abnormalities as not consistent with dementia. Dr. Brody is an attending psychiatrist at New York's Bellevue Hospital and a professor at New York University's School of Medicine. He also conducts research on schizophrenia.
Mr. Gigante, at the time of the scan, was purportedly taking medication that affects the brain. And because it affects the brain, it affects brain chemistry. And brain chemistry is what a PET scan is all about.
Gigante was taking an antipsychotic medication, and antidepressants, a low-potency tranquilizer, and sleeping pills. So Dr. Brody was skeptical about the PET scan, but had yet to examine the patient.
When the three of us entered the observation room, the examining room where he was then brought, I was struck at first by his appearance, which I said made me think, oh my God, he really is sick. I've missed the boat. He's really very sick. He came in wearing a bathrobe, he was shuffling, he was mumbling, he was making allusions to God.
But as the examination progressed, some of Gigante's actions began to raise doubts.
But one of the things that really struck me was that I didn't note at the time, but I noted a few seconds later, was when I put out my hand for him to shake it, he didn't shake it. And that's a very automatic behavior. You put your hand out, your worst enemy can put his hand out to you, and you tend to take it.
How about this way?
When Gigante was asked the names of his children, he didn't know. When he was asked where he lived, he didn't know.
And yet, these are things that people tend not to forget. You know, the brain in a dementia tends to work on the process of accounting. The last in, first out. So recent memory tends to be lost, but that's why people who are very demented can often remember very well events from long ago, even if they can't remember recent events. Well, he was not consistent on that. Indeed, he was asked the question about who the President of the United States was, which is a standard question on a psychiatric mental status evaluation. And he scratched his head and he looked perplexed and he said, I should know that. I should know that answer. It's in there somewhere. And some more questions were asked. He said, I really should know that. And then finally he said, Bush. George Bush. And I sat there and thought, oh, he remembered the question. What was striking was not that the answer was incorrect. What was striking was that the question was remembered despite all of the interfering questions.
And there were other red flags. He seemed to understand abstract concepts. Dr. Brody asked Gigante if he was proud of his children.
Now, pride is really quite an abstract notion. And his response was, yes, they're all working. Legitimate jobs. Legitimacy? Well, that wasn't even a question. Legitimate implies yet something else, that he was able to abstract from the question some intent as to what the question was involved with, and awareness of a distinction between legitimacy and illegitimacy. And here was a man who didn't know what month it was. He didn't know if he was in a hospital.
These and other inconsistencies contributed to Dr. Brody's conclusion that Gigante did not suffer from progressive dementia, vascular dementia, or schizophrenia. Guards assigned to watch Gigante during his pre-sentencing hospitalization also found his behavior normal. They testified that he was active around his prison hospital cell and polite to the hospital staff. He did not need help to shower, to groom himself, or to feed himself.
The lawyers all put in affidavits that they couldn't communicate with Vincent Gigante at all. Well, when he was in jail, he managed to speak with the prison counselors. When you sort of talk to the sort of low-level people in jail who have to take care of inmates on a day-to-day basis, it turns out he knew exactly what had happened. He knew he had been on trial. He knew that Gravano had testified against him and didn't have very nice things to say about him. He knew that his sentencing was upcoming. He knew what the issue was before Judge Weinstein as to that he had to decide that he was competent to be sentenced. It was completely at odds with what his lawyers were telling Judge Weinstein.
Some psychiatrists thought Gigante really was incompetent. Others thought he was faking. 5 months and dozens of tests later, the judge ruled. The judge said, "In short, the defendant's cognitive and emotional capacity and his communication skills are equivalent to other 69-year-old defendants with limited education. No hallucinations interfere with his abilities to participate in sentencing. He understands the fundamentals of criminal substantive law and procedure. He is deliberately feigning mental illness to avoid punishment which he fears. Defendant is competent to be sentenced and to serve an appropriate term in prison." Shaliro described efforts of the FBI and prosecutors as historic and courageous.
This has been a battle that certainly I've been involved with for the last 20 years, and certainly I think agents that will continue that on over the next 5 or 6 years. If the effort could be sustained and the resources maintained, I think we're on the verge of really reducing the effects and the impact of the Cosa Nostra.
To be sure, the government's legal victory in the Gigante case was partial. The jury, after all, failed to convict him of the 6 murder charges. He was originally sentenced to 12 years. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and earned 3 more years, finally admitting in court that he had been faking insanity the entire time.